It wasn't a Solonian army, but a swarm of monsters, countless magical creatures covering the entire field. Short goblins and taller, canine-headed kobolds hunched forward, brandishing pickaxes and hand axes while emitting low, guttural growls. More horrifying were the human-like ghouls with rotting skin and bloodthirsty, hollow eyes, moaning for flesh. An undead army crawled from a nightmare. There were tens of thousands of them, filling the open ground completely. Their stench and evil aura were so potent that I saw the sentries on the walls feel nauseous and panic from afar. Enemy attack. Monsters. So many monsters, a sentry screamed, scrambling down the wall in terror. The alarm bells rang through Confort. Brendan, Richter, Leon, and I rushed to the walls. Seeing the hellish scene outside, I felt my scalp tingle, and I saw our expressions turn grave. I stared at the twisted figures within the Solonian lines, forcing myself to stay calm. I didn't expect the Solonians to drive monsters at us. This is trouble. I frowned, analyzing the situation. While these monsters may not kill many soldiers directly, their sheer numbers and suicidal charges threaten our defensive equipment like the wolf-tooth slammer and rolling logs. Brendan gripped his sword, confused. They aren't here voluntarily. They're being controlled. But how do the Solonians have the power to command these creatures? Edgar spoke grimly. This isn't ordinary warfare. Ancient texts mention northern shamans or warlocks capable of driving dark creatures. This is likely dark magic. Edgar looked at the approaching tide and added firmly, regardless, the enemy is here. We must prepare to fight. Agreed. I shouted, my voice carrying across the wall. Order the army. Archers and musketeers to your positions. Swordsmen, armor up. Prepare for melee. My composure steadied those around me. Officers quickly suppressed their shock and rushed to their defensive sectors. Though pale and trembling, the soldiers' training kicked in, and they moved into position. Musketeers checked their fuses and flint, loaders prepared paper cartridges, and archers placed arrows within reach. A dull, eerie horn sounded from the Solon camp, and the sea of monsters erupted. A whoa, squeak, hiss. Goblins, kobolds, and ghouls roared, launching a frenzied charge at Conford's outer wall. They lacked formation, driven only by instinct and numbers, many carrying crude wooden ladders. I stood on the wall, metal whistle in my mouth, calculating the distance. 2 kilometers, 1 kilometer, 500 meters, 300, 100. The front line entered effective range, but I waited for the optimal moment. 70 meters. The kobold's scales glinted, and the ground shook from the charge. Tweet. My sharp whistle pierced the air. Fire, the officers roared. Fire at will. Bang, bang, bang. Dense musket fire erupted, white smoke billowing as hot lead tore into the monster swarm. Blood mist exploded in the front ranks. Goblins and kobolds fell in heaps. Simultaneously, archers loosed volleys, arrows raining down with a shrill whistle. The charge hit an invisible wall. The fragile monsters were mowed down like wheat. Even the tough ghouls staggered, riddled with arrows and lead, emitting foul black smoke. The area 50 to 100 meters out became a slaughterhouse, stalling the charge. But the rear ranks, mindless and hungry, trampled their fallen comrades without hesitation. As one wave fell, 2 more surged forward, dragging ladders to the base of the wall. Push them off, Richter roared, as spearmen used poles to shove the ladders away. The heavy ladders crashed down, crushing the monsters below. Arrow towers and embrasures spat fire, mercilessly raking the monsters at the wall's base. A few ghouls and goblins managed to climb up, but Roland's infantry were ready, skewering them with spears. Greatswords cleaved goblins in two, turning the wall top into a brutal melee. Below, goblins fired weak bone arrows, but they mostly clattered harmlessly against shields and battlements. They posed little threat to the well-equipped defenders. It became a war of attrition. Monsters spent lives, defenders spent ammunition. The monster waves crashed against the wall like an endless tide. The defenders held firm using fortifications and firepower. Release the stones. Prepare the logs. Drop them. Heavy rocks and logs rolled down, crushing bones and clearing sections of the wall. The spiked wolf-tooth slammer was lowered, flattening enemies before being retracted, leaving behind mangled limbs. Despite the effectiveness of the siege weapons, the monsters seemed infinite. Worse, they felt no fear, climbing over the corpses of their kin to reach the top. While casualties were low, the high-intensity combat exhausted the spearmen and swordsmen. Wearing heavy plate armor, every strike became a grueling effort. The narrow wall, built in haste, only allowed 2 soldiers to fight side by side. This prevented rotation, forcing the frontline soldiers to fight without respite. Even the bravest warriors began to show fatigue. I watched Roderick grip his spear, stabbing mechanically at the monsters appearing over the parapet. His arms were numb, his hands bleeding, but he held his position with sheer willpower. Beside him stood a young, green militia recruit from France City. I watched the inexperienced recruit tremble, his movements stiffening as he faced the rotting monsters. A towering ghoul lunged over the battlement, its maw wide and stench overwhelming. Terrified, the recruit shrieked and thrust his spear wildly, missing the ghoul entirely. The gap in the line was immediate. The ghoul prepared to scale the wall. "Steady! Aim for the throat!" Roderick roared. Abandoning his own target, Roderick pivoted and thrust his spear with desperate force. Squelch! The spear pierced the ghoul's neck, sending it plummeting from the wall. As Roderick recovered, a nimble kobold darted from the shadows. It seized the shaft of Roderick's spear before he could retract it. Roderick shook the spear, trying to dislodge the creature. Instead, the agile kobold scrambled up the shaft like a monkey, lunging at him. Roderick swung the spear violently, but the kobold held fast. The creature leaped, slamming into Roderick's face. Fortunately, I had equipped the front line with sturdy plate armor. The kobold struck the helmet with a dull thud, causing no injury. Yet, the beast clung to his head like an octopus. Its claws scraped against the metal, creating a deafening screech that disoriented Roderick. Losing his balance, he dropped his spear and stumbled backward. Roderick fell from the wall, the kobold still clinging to him. I watched the recruit stare in despair as his savior vanished. The wall was low, and the ground below was soft from recent rain. Roderick landed hard on his back. The impact left him dazed and breathless. His armor absorbed the blow, sparing him from broken bones. The kobold was thrown off during the fall. It landed nimbly and quickly regained its footing. The creature locked eyes with the struggling Roderick. It shrieked and lunged for the exposed gap at his neck. Trapped by his heavy armor, Roderick could only watch helplessly. Suddenly, I struck with a flash of cold light. My sword pierced the kobold, pinning it to the ground. The creature died instantly. Roderick looked up to see me, his savior. I stood over the corpse, yanking my blade free. "Can you move?" I asked. "Yes, my lord." Roderick gritted his teeth, fighting the pain. He was choked with gratitude. I hauled him up and propped him against the wall. The heavy armor made the effort difficult even for me. "Thank you, my lord," Roderick gasped. He tried to stand, desperate to return to his post. "Stay down," I commanded, pointing toward the stairs. A fresh squad of veterans was already ascending. They moved with precision, immediately filling the gap and engaging the monsters. The line stabilized. "The line is secure," I told him. "Your task is to recover." I removed Roderick's battered helmet. Roderick breathed deeply, his heart rate slowing. I patted his shoulder and departed without another word. I hurried to a hidden assembly area. Leon and 50 cavalrymen waited, horses restless and ready. "The men are at their limit," I told Leon. "Your cavalry must create an opening for a rotation. I will have the musketeers clear the gate area. You will charge out, disrupt the enemy, and return. Harass them, don't commit to a full battle. Do you understand?" "Understood, my lord," Leon replied. He immediately rallied his men. I blew a specific rhythm on my whistle. It was the signal for the reserve force. 100 musketeers and 60 militiamen moved into position. Though weary and panicked, the well-trained troops quickly assembled behind the city gate under my watch. Without needing orders, the musketeers formed 3 ranks, kneeling, crouching, and standing, aiming their muskets at the closed gate. Under my command, 2 militia platoons lined up on either side of the gate. Though less equipped than regulars, the militia's expressions were resolute despite their nerves as I observed them. I shouted over the din. "Listen, Your only task is to hold the gate in defensive formation once Leon's cavalry charges out. Sword and shield infantry in front. Hold your shields tight. Spearmen behind. Thrust through the gaps. Seal the breach. Let no monster through. I commanded. I warned. Listen closely. When I signal, you must clear the path for our returning cavalry. Anyone who delays or lets a monster in will face military law. Understood, the 60 men roared. I turned to the musketeers. When the gate opens and I whistle, fire a volley. Then immediately clear the center for the cavalry. Move fast, or you'll be trampled. Understood, the musketeers shouted, gripping their weapons. Move, I commanded. Soldiers removed the heavy crossbeam and pulled the massive wooden gates open while I watched. The screech of the opening gate pierced the battlefield noise as I stood ready. The monsters, caught off guard by the gate opening from within, paused in their assault as I watched from my position. As the gap widened, I whistled. Fire! 100 muskets erupted in a storm of lead, clearing the monsters clustered at the gate before my eyes. Scatter! Move! I screamed. The musketeers retreated to the sides, leaving the path clear as I had ordered. A second later, thunderous hoofbeats echoed. Leon's heavy cavalry surged out like a steel torrent past me. The armored riders ignored the gore, trampling monsters while swinging scimitars, maces, and spears. Blood sprayed as the cavalry tore a massive gap through the chaotic monster horde. I whistled twice. The militia platoons immediately surged forward, sealing the gate passage behind the cavalry. Sword and shield infantry hold. Sergeant Miller roared under my command. The front lines slammed their shields into the ground, bracing their backs against them to form an impenetrable wall. The spearmen thrust their weapons through the gaps, creating a lethal forest of points. Recovering from the cavalry charge, the monsters roared and surged toward the gate again. Thud, thud, thud. Goblins and kobolds slammed into the shields. The infantry gritted their teeth, holding their ground against the impact. Strike, the officer bellowed. The infantry hacked at the monsters with hand axes and short swords. The spearmen behind them worked with mechanical efficiency, thrusting and retracting. Each strike found a target, drawing blood and gore. The gate became a meat grinder, with monster corpses piling up and hindering further attacks. The militia faced immense pressure as monsters clawed at their shields. Though exhausted and aching, no one retreated, knowing the city gate lay behind them. This wall of flesh and will bought critical time for the cavalry and the garrison. Seeing the intensity of the assault, I blew 3 sharp whistles. Tweet, tweet, tweet. The signal cut through the chaos to the ramparts. Brendan, watching from above, understood my signal. Rotate. First and third ranks, retreat. Second and fourth, move up. Quickly, Brendan commanded. The exhausted defenders retreated down the stairs. The fresh reserve force rushed up to secure the line. With the cavalry causing chaos below, the pressure on the walls eased, allowing a smooth rotation. I saw the new troops stabilize the ramparts. I knew I had to recall the cavalry before the monsters surrounded them. Standard bearer, signal retreat. Hornblower, sound the retreat. I ordered. The retreat flag waved, and the horn blast echoed. The cavalry heard the signal. Leon crushed a kobold's skull and roared, "Retreat! All units, fall back to the gate." The cavalry turned, covering each other as they fought toward the gate. Exiting was harder than entering. The sheer number of monsters swarmed the horses, clawing at their legs. Progress was agonizingly slow, and Leon watched in desperation. Near the gate, a rider was dragged down by ghouls and swarmed. "No," Leon cried, but he pressed on, knowing stopping meant total annihilation. Suddenly, a figure plummeted from the wall like a meteor, scattering monsters upon landing. It was Master Andre, his glowing sword cutting through the horde like a scythe as I watched. I cut through the monster swarm like a blade, reaching the fallen cavalryman. With a few flashes of my sword, I cleared the surrounding monsters, revealing the bloodied, struggling soldier. Master Andre hauled the man up, fought off the monsters, mounted the riderless horse, and galloped toward the gate. I watched from the gate and shouted, "Clear the path." The militia stepped aside. Leon's remaining cavalry and Master Andre surged through the gate. "Close the gate," I commanded. The militia slammed the gate shut, and dropped the heavy beam into place. Sword and shield infantry and spearmen quickly dispatched the few monsters that had slipped inside. The gate was sealed. Outside, monsters roared and hammered the wood. Inside, the survivors gasped for air. Realizing the gate was impenetrable, the monsters turned their focus back to the walls. They swarmed the base, but the situation had shifted. During the cavalry sortie, the defenders had not been idle. They used long poles to push down or destroy the ladders the monsters had managed to raise. Now, the monsters lacked climbing tools and were forced to crowd the base, where they were easily picked off by fire and projectiles. Fresh defenders poured fire from the battlements, preventing any new ladders from being set. The siege devolved into a war of attrition favoring the defenders. Hermod watched from his command tent, his expression grim. The magical creatures had consumed vast amounts of ammunition, but failed to take a single section of the wall. Piles of monster corpses lay below, while few Plantagenet soldiers had fallen. Brainless waste, Hermod muttered, frustrated by their lack of tactics. Mage Thor warned that the monsters were indiscriminate, preventing Solon soldiers from providing ranged support. Hermod consoled himself with the monsters' apparent endless numbers. Through his telescope, he saw the defenders tiring, their pace of defense slowing. He remained convinced that continued pressure would eventually break their line. Just as he prepared to commit reinforcements, disaster struck. The monster army suddenly froze, as if their strings had been cut. Their roars ceased, and they stood motionless, even as the defenders struck them. Hermod turned to Mage Thor in shock, demanding they resume the attack. Thor was deathly pale, sweating profusely, his hands trembling. "My spirit is exhausted," Thor rasped. "I cannot maintain control, or I will die before the line breaks." Thor made a final, shaky gesture. The monsters retreated in a chaotic, disorderly mass, leaving the battlefield in stunned silence. "No, come back," Hermod roared, trembling with rage. He struck the tent pillar, watching the defense of Conford stabilize. The failure left him consumed by fury. The initial assault had ended in a pathetic retreat. On the walls, cheers erupted. "We won! Long live Conford! Long live the Lord!" The new recruits wept with relief, their morale bolstered by the sight of the intact walls. I stood among them, my expression grave. I noted the depleted ammunition and the exhausted state of my men. This was only the first probe. The true test was yet to come. Hermod knew he could not allow the defenders a moment to recover. He decided to employ a brutal war of attrition. He ordered his auxiliary soldiers to cut timber for shield carts. Meanwhile, he let his elite Solon warriors rest and eat. He would not waste his core forces on the walls yet. His gaze shifted to the prisoner camp. It was packed with shivering, ragged Plantagenet captives. These were civilians and soldiers captured from fallen territories. Those regions had fallen quickly, unlike the stubborn Conford. Hermod saw these people not as lives, but as expendable resources. He would use them as human shields to drain the defenders' supplies. He ordered an officer to arm the captives with sticks and drive them toward the walls by afternoon. The officer hesitated, noting their lack of combat ability. Hermod sneered, "That is the point. They are to die to exhaust the defenders' strength. Execute the order." The officer obeyed, and Hermod turned his telescope back to the walls of Conford. I envisioned the agony and hesitation of the defenders when they realized they were being forced to attack their own kin. Whether they chose to fire or falter, I saw it as a win. Mage Thor watched with a twisted smirk, his raspy voice mocking me. "Commander, you call my necromancy cruel. Yet your strategy of using living men as cannon fodder is hardly any better." My face twitched, but I offered no rebuttal, silently accepting the brutality required for victory. At the edge of the Solon camp, Einar sat in a corner, struggling to swallow dry black bread with tepid water. Einar had survived. His unit had been decimated in the battle beneath Conford Mountain. He had feigned death among the corpses to escape the slaughter. When the France City cavalry charged, he thought his end had come. Miraculously, his Plantagenet slave, Thomas, had retrieved his spooked warhorse. The two escaped the carnage together on that single horse. Einar eventually reunited with the main Sparrow Legion. Having lost his gear and achieved no glory, he could not return home to Jarvik, so he remained with the Legion to seek redemption. Today, he returned to the shadow of comfort. Watching magical creatures charge the walls and hearing the familiar, terrifying roar of muskets, his heart raced, his palms slick with sweat. The gunfire triggered nightmares of the battle a month ago, where veterans like Torkel were easily cut down through their plate armor. Thomas stood by, guarding their only remaining asset, the horse. Einar finished his bread and went to the cauldron for a bowl of hot, oily broth. He handed the bowl to Thomas. Thomas recoiled, stammering, "Master, you should eat." "I'll stick to the black bread." Einar frowned, his tone harsh. "Eat it. Don't talk back. You need strength to watch the horse." Thomas took the bowl with trembling hands, thanking him profusely. Once Einar turned away, Thomas drank greedily, ignoring the heat. He couldn't remember the last time he tasted meat. This broth was a feast. By evening, auxiliaries and slaves had cobbled together several crude, sturdy shield carts. These mobile wooden houses, covered in thick logs and stolen doors, were designed to deflect arrows and musket balls. The second wave began. This time, instead of a chaotic slave charge, the assault was led by these slow, advancing shield carts. Plantagenet slaves pushed the heavy structures toward the walls. Behind them, Solon soldiers used whips and blades to drive the terrified slaves forward. The slaves were forced to serve as human shields and expendable fodder. The defenders spotted them immediately. Archers, musketeers aim. Arrows and bullets rained down. The projectiles merely clattered off the thick wood or embedded themselves harmlessly. Though some slaves fell to stray fire, the carts continued their relentless advance. I ordered, "Cease fire. Save ammunition." The walls fell silent, save for the creaking wheels and the slaves' cries. Watching from afar, I smirked. I believed the defenders were helpless, forced to wait for the inevitable melee. "So that's all you have," I muttered, confident of victory. I imagined the despair on the defenders' faces as my Solon warriors swarmed the walls. My smile soon froze. As the lead carts reached the 100-meter mark, nearing the final charge, the impossible happened. The heavy gates of Con Ford swung open, stunning the advancing Solonians into a momentary halt. Instead of a cavalry sortie, the defenders pushed out a massive object. A heavy cannon, its cold metal barrel glinting with lethal intent. Gunners quickly maneuvered the piece, aiming the dark muzzle directly at the lead shield cart. "Cannon! They have a cannon!" The Solonians screamed in terror. Solon archers instinctively fired at the exposed gunners, hoping to destroy the weapon. The defenders were prepared. Infantry with large shields rushed from the gate, forming a wall to protect the artillery crew. The arrows thudded harmlessly into the shields. The master gunner completed his preparations. Calmly, he inserted the fuse and touched it with a burning brand. Hiss! The fuse sparked. The gunners covered their ears and crouched. The battlefield fell into an eerie silence. Both sides held their breath. I watched through my telescope, my smug expression replaced by horror and dread. I stood speechless as a deafening roar erupted. A flash of fire burst from the gate, and a 6-pound iron ball shrieked through the air, slamming into the center of the lead shield cart. The thick wood shattered like paper. The iron ball punched through the cart as if it were butter. The slaves pushing the cart were instantly obliterated, their bodies torn to shreds. Flesh and wood splinters sprayed backward as the ball carved a path of gore. The ball, its momentum barely checked, continued forward to plow into the ranks of the Solon soldiers behind. A piercing scream erupted as cannon fire tore through the ranks, turning bodies into mangled piles of flesh and bone, leaving a gruesome trail of blood. The entire battlefield seemed to freeze in that instant. The slaves pushing the shield carts stood paralyzed, and even the Solon soldiers supervising from the rear were stunned. I watched Hermod gasp in disbelief, his voice shrill. Artillery? How could they possibly have artillery? He had accounted for muskets, bows, and logs, but never a powerful cannon hidden within this crude border fortress. The shield cart tactic was shattered. On the walls of Con Ford, I heard the defenders erupt in fervent cheers. The cannon blast shattered the enemy's morale. As the first shield cart lay in ruins, I watched the gunners swiftly reload, aiming at the next target. Merged with 8,583, watching through his telescope, Hermod was consumed by fury and fear. He could not allow this weapon to destroy his siege equipment. Trumpeter, Hermod roared. Sound the charge. Destroy that cannon at all costs. The desolate horn of a full-scale assault drowned out the battlefield. Terrified but bound by orders, Solon soldiers drove the Plantagenet slaves forward like sheep, charging toward the gate and the deadly cannon. A sea of humanity surged forward, hoping to overwhelm the defense. Boom! A second deafening blast pulverized another shield cart. As the Solonians closed in, I signaled the defenders to retreat with a sharp whistle. The gunners quickly dragged the cannon inside. Solon archers unleashed a volley, but the defenders' shields held firm. Driven by blades, the Plantagenet slaves reached the death zone within 50 meters of the wall. Many slaves wailed, pleading for mercy as they recognized the banners above. My defenders hesitated, fingers frozen on triggers and bowstrings, unable to slaughter their own kin. I stood on the ramparts, my expression cold. I knew hesitation was betrayal. This was war. There was no room for mercy. I blew a sharp, piercing note on my whistle. Free fire. The command forced the soldiers to steel themselves and unleash their weapons. Bang, 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 whoosh, whoosh. A hail of lead and arrows mowed down the front line of slaves, painting the ground red. The carnage plunged the remaining slaves into chaotic panic. Solon archers seized the moment to advance and loose a volley at the walls. Several musketeers fell. I immediately ordered, "Musketeers, retreat. Combat soldiers, move up." The Solon vanguard was nearly upon the retreating cannon, desperate to destroy it. Rumble. Thunderous hooves echoed from the gate as I watched Leon lead the heavy cavalry in a steel tide. Ignoring the slaves, the cavalry trampled through them, charging straight at the Solon archers and infantry. Like tigers among sheep, the cavalry swung sabers and maces, turning the Solon ranks into a bloodbath. The Solonians, caught off guard by the fierce countercharge, broke and fled in terror. I watched Leon's cavalry crush the vanguard with repeated charges. A new whistle signaled the retreat. Seeing the rout, Leon ordered, "Retreat. Back to the castle." The cavalry and the cannon withdrew safely, and the heavy gates slammed shut behind them. Outside lay a field of corpses, broken carts, and fleeing soldiers. Hermod's assault had been utterly thwarted by the cannon and the cavalry. Looking at the mangled wreckage and the carnage among his men, Hermod's face turned ashen. He ordered an immediate retreat. The Solon army pulled back to their camp, leaving dozens of dead behind, and silence returned to the battlefield. Hermod dared not attack again. The cannon was beyond his current capabilities. He needed to report to his superiors. That night, inside the Lord's Hall of Conford, I held a post-battle meeting. Edgar reported, "My lord, here is the summary of today's defense. 3 dead, 11 lightly wounded, and 5 seriously injured. The wounded are being treated. We expended 800 musket rounds, 300 arrows, 12 stones, 8 logs, and 2 wolf-tooth slammers. The consumption was well within acceptable limits, given the results." I nodded, addressing my officers. "Excellent work today. You held the walls against superior numbers and magical creatures with minimal losses." The atmosphere in the hall brightened. Brynden praised me. "It was your foresight in building the outer wall that saved us." Leon added excitedly, "Those monsters are nothing. As long as we have ammo, they're just throwing their lives away. At this rate, the Solonians will never set foot in Conford." The officers were filled with confidence. They believed they could hold until reinforcements arrived from Count Rockefort. In the corner, the captive Solon commander Thorstein listened, hiding his complex emotions. He felt a mix of lingering fear and relief. He realized how foolish he had been to challenge Leon's cavalry in the Black Forest Valley. If the defenders had possessed this firepower then, his battalion would have been annihilated instantly. He felt lucky to have surrendered. He had saved his life and now witnessed the true power of this army. He was certain that joining me was the wisest decision of his life. Meanwhile, in the Solon camp, the mood was heavy. Hermod, Onag, Mage Thor, and the Kiliarch sat in grim silence. "That cannon is too powerful," Hermod said darkly. "Our shield carts are useless against it. Further frontal assaults are just suicide." Onag nodded nervously. "I warned you Conford's firearms were formidable. but I never expected such a massive weapon. Commander, a direct assault is suicide. A Chiliarch asked, is there no other way? Perhaps a night raid or tunneling? Hermod shook his head. Night raid? Their walls are brightly lit and heavily patrolled. As for tunneling, it takes too long, and their high ground makes us easy targets. Time is our greatest enemy. Hermod turned to the silent mage Thor. Can you summon more powerful magical creatures? Wave after wave of attacks will eventually exhaust their ammunition and supplies. Mage Thor sneered from beneath his hood. Do you think summoning abyss forces is child's play? Maintaining these cannon fodder already drains my spirit and precious materials. Stronger entities require sacrifices beyond your imagination. Furthermore, the mana flow here cannot support such high-level summoning. This is my limit. His words extinguished any hope of a magical breakthrough, leaving the tent in desperate silence. Hermod, a cautious commander, weighed the situation and made his choice. He slammed the table. No more blind assaults. Conford's defenses and firepower far exceed our capabilities. Continued attacks are a pointless waste of troops. He rose. Order the army to switch to a tight siege starting tomorrow. Fortify the camp, increase scouts, and sever all contact between Conford and the outside world. Dispatch a messenger immediately to inform Legion Commander Ulf of the situation, especially the cannon. Request professional siege equipment and reinforcements. Until new orders arrive, no one is to attack without my command. Most officers silently agreed. The heavy losses and the psychological trauma of the cannon made them favor a temporary truce. Before dawn, cold mist blanketed the desolate northern frontier. A weary, scarred warhorse carried its master slowly across the land of death and despair. The rider was Friedrich von Schmidt. His once glorious knight plate armor was dinted and bloodstained, with a terrifying crater in the breastplate from a battle axe. His cloak was tattered, soaked in mud and ash. His helmet was lost, revealing a young, resolute face. Though caked in sweat and grime, his eyes burned with unyielding fire. Behind him, the Winterholm fortress flew the wolf banner of the Solonians instead of the Plantagenet flag, a final insult. Friedrich had failed to hold it. Under the relentless tide of the Solon army, the fortress's fragile defenses had shattered. Friedrich and a few desperate soldiers had fought to the end. They stood like rocks until every comrade fell, staining the land with their blood. Friedrich eventually carved a path out with his remaining men. Pursued by Solon cavalry, he alone survived through sheer skill. As the sole witness to Winterholm's fall, he chose not to flee to the Eagle's Nest fortress. He knew Count Eisenberg's cowardly, selfish nature would never lead him to open the gates for a lone survivor. Moreover, he despised the so-called Guardian of the North for watching his allies perish while cowering behind walls. Winterholm's fall amid the Blackstone Pass defense line was effectively dead. Countless Solonians were now flooding through this gap into the unprotected plains of the Plantagenet kingdom. They would spread like a plague, burning and killing every village and town. Their target was undoubtedly the final strategic point, Old Osric Castle, the last barrier before the royal capital, Place. If that fortress fell, the path to the kingdom's heart would be wide open. Place would be threatened, plunging the kingdom into chaos. The weight of this responsibility crushed Friedrich. He had lost his fortress and his men. He had witnessed the corruption of the kingdom's defense and the cowardice of its leaders. But he could not fall. He was Friedrich von Schmidt, eldest son of the Schmidt family and a sworn knight of the Plantagenet kingdom. A knight's oath was to the kingdom, the people, and justice. Honor and duty sustained his broken body and spirit. Even alone, wounded, and facing impossible odds, he would fight on, for his fallen comrades, the innocent, and his own untarnished honor. He pulled the reins, turning away from the burning ruins. He spurred his horse, which neighed wearily, and marched toward the south, toward the final battlefield. The lone knight, burdened by failure but fueled by faith, charged into the deepest darkness before dawn. 3 days later, Old Osric Castle, the final strategic fortress, was under siege. Standing on the walls, I found the sight enough to suffocate any veteran. The Solon army's camp was a black tide drowning the land outside. Tents, wooden barricades, and countless campfires stretched to the horizon. The air hummed with the restlessness of a massive army. Elite Solon cavalry galloped beneath the walls. They brandished scimitars and roared, flaunting their strength and morale. The thunder of hooves shook the walls. General Reynard, the gray-haired commander of old Osric Castle, watched with a heavy heart. He ordered the defenders to fire, but I watched as the sporadic gunfire and muffled cannon shots were like stones dropped into an ocean against such a vast force. They caused little damage, only highlighting the defenders' weakness. Worse, the Solonians began psychological warfare. Arrows with blunt tips, carrying parchment scrolls, rained into the city. Soldiers retrieved them for General Reynard. He unfolded one, written in clear Plantagenet. To the defenders of old Osric Castle, our 100,000-strong army, under the command of the Great Herald, has surrounded this city. France City, Eagle's Nest, and Wharton's Castle have all cowered and will send no aid. You are trapped beasts, and your end is near. My warriors crave glory. Upon victory, we shall enact the 3 days of unrestricted plunder. None shall be spared, and all wealth shall be ash. This is no idle threat. Yet, heaven favors the merciful. If you surrender now, I swear by the God of war. The surrender terms promised safety for soldiers, protection of private property, and amnesty for nobles and officials who pledged loyalty. The army only sought passage and guaranteed no harm to the populace. Surrender meant survival and prosperity. Resistance meant total annihilation. The ultimatum expired in one day. Similar surrender letters flooded the city like snow. The contents spread rapidly, sparking panic and instability among the defenders and civilians. I watched General Reynard urgently summon his officers and key officials. The meeting immediately devolved into heated debate. Pro-war veterans argued, "General, we cannot surrender. Old Osric Castle is the final barrier to the royal capital. We owe our lives to the kingdom. We must fight. The castle is sturdy and well-stocked. The Solonians are poor at sieges. If we hold, the king's loyalist army will arrive to crush them. Surrender would make us traitors for eternity. We would rather die in battle than live in shame." The pro-surrender faction countered, "Be realistic. There are 100,000 enemies outside and fewer than 3,000 of us. Where are the reinforcements? France City and Eaglenest are already lost. The king hasn't paid the troops in 6 months. Morale is shattered. Who is left to fight to the death? The Solonians promise safety if we surrender. If we resist and fail, it will be a massacre. Think of the people, General." The debate raged from day to night, fueling the city's growing terror. I watched Reynard attempt to send elite cavalry to request aid from the royal capital under cover of night. The knights were intercepted and slaughtered by Solonian scouts. Their severed heads were displayed on spears outside the castle gates, extinguishing the final hope. Watching the enemy torches and hearing the city's cries, I saw Reynard's resolve crumble under the weight of his responsibility and the grim reality of his position. The next morning, I saw a visibly aged Reynard gather his officials. With a hoarse voice, he announced, "Raise the white flag. Open the gates. We surrender." The pro-war officers were devastated. Some wept, while others were restrained from committing suicide. The pro-surrender faction felt only heavy shame and emptiness. As the heavy gates groaned open, I watched the defenders in agony. A white flag was hoisted atop the highest tower. Old Osric Castle, the last northern bastion, surrendered without firing a single shot. I watched Friedrich ride alone toward Old Osric Castle. The 3-day journey felt like a descent into hell. The sights he witnessed left permanent scars on his soul. Once peaceful villages were now smoldering ruins. Charred frames and blood-stained walls marked the sites of massacres. Bodies littered the fields. Men were butchered, and women were violated and left to rot under the gray sky. The bodies of Plantagenet soldiers were hung on wooden poles as a barbaric display of Solonian intimidation. Surviving children hid in the ruins, weeping for their dead parents, a sight that I saw pierce Friedrich's heart. Consumed by rage, grief, and guilt, I watched him grip his reins until his knuckles turned white. He loathed the Solonians' cruelty and the kingdom's incompetence. He had to hold the line. This conviction drove him toward the final hope, Old Osric Castle. Designed as the final barrier to the royal capital, The fortress was meant to be impregnable. When he finally spotted the castle, I saw him freeze in disbelief. There was no battle, no smoke, no resistance. Only a white flag fluttering in the wind. The gates stood wide open, and Solonian soldiers marched in unchallenged. Solonian warriors now manned the ramparts and towers. The castle hadn't fallen. It had surrendered. A wave of blinding rage shattered his reason. The sacrifices he had witnessed along the road now felt like a cruel mockery. While the North bled and died, this fortress, the strategic linchpin, had given up. It had hoarded resources and taxes only to betray the kingdom. They had welcomed the enemy without firing a shot. Traitors! Cowards! Reynard, you spineless wretch! Friedrich thought of his fallen comrades at Winterholm and the innocent dead he had passed. The surrender was an act of supreme cowardice, sacrificing the kingdom for personal safety. With his last shred of reason gone, he was consumed by fire. He would not retreat. He would show them the unyielding spirit of a Plantagenet knight. He would offer the enemy's blood to the fallen. For Plantagenet, he charged his exhausted horse into the rear of the Solonian column. The Solonians were complacent, celebrating their bloodless victory. The rearguard, mostly logistics troops, was caught completely off guard. Friedrich struck like a storm, his sword decapitating a Solonian soldier before the man could react. Enemy attack! The cry went up. Chaos erupted in the rear as the soldiers turned to see a blood-soaked knight fighting like a demon. His blade flashed, each strike claiming a life amidst screams of terror. Pouring all his grief and fury into his sword, Friedrich fought with the peak of his martial skill. I watched Friedrich charge into the Solon soldiers, carving a bloody path through their ranks with ease. The Solonians were stunned by his singular, ferocious assault, retreating in terror or dropping their weapons in fear. As chaos spread, I saw the commotion reach Stark, a Tier 3 knight overseeing the march. Stark turned his horse, bellowing in rage. What is happening back there? Seeing the carnage and the lone Plantagenet knight, I watched Stark's shock quickly turn to fury. Useless fools. It's just one man. Kill him, he roared at his guards. I watched Friedrich cut down the guards instantly. Stark's pupils constricted. He realized this was no ordinary foe. Drawing his heavy scimitar, Stark charged. Die, you arrogant Plantagenet mongrel. Stark was confident in his strength, but as they crossed paths, I saw there was no clash of steel. Only a blinding, lethal flash of light passed by. Stark's confidence froze into sheer horror. Before he could swing his blade, I saw him feel a chill at his neck. His head soared into the air, eyes wide with shock. Blood erupted from his neck as his headless corpse slumped and hit the ground. Without looking back, I watched Friedrich snatch the severed head by its braid, holding it high. The blood-soaked knight stood amidst the chaos like a vengeful demon. Silence fell over the Solon rearguard. Seeing their commander's head, I saw the thousands of soldiers paralyzed by terror. Friedrich stood tall, displaying Stark's gruesome head to the enemy. He roared to the Plantagenet soldiers. Men of Plantagenet, take up your arms. Follow me. For our fallen brothers and the glory of the kingdom, drive these Solon bastards out. His voice carried a divine authority that shattered the despair of the Plantagenet soldiers at the gate. Seeing the lone knight's victory and the enemy's head held aloft, I saw their long-suppressed rage ignite. Damn it, let's fight, a young lieutenant shouted, grabbing his sword. For Plantagenet, follow the knight. Kill them. Avenge our brothers. The sentiment spread like wildfire. I watched soldiers and officers alike grab their weapons, some even attacking Solonians with their bare hands. A chain reaction began. The garrison on the walls, previously forced to surrender, was ignited by the roar below. They're fighting back. Kill these invaders, the defenders shouted, launching a counterattack. They swarmed the Solonians on the ramparts, using fists, teeth, and debris as weapons. The Solonians, caught off guard by the sheep, turning on them, were shoved off the walls to their deaths. The gate area descended into a brutal, bloody melee. Friedrich led the charge, a sharp spearhead cutting down every Solonian in his path. His bravery galvanized the Plantagenet soldiers. Despite their disorganized state, their hatred and momentum forced the Solon army to retreat. The sounds of slaughter echoed throughout the area. Every inch of ground was soaked in blood as the Plantagenet soldiers reclaimed their space. The Solonians, their formation broken and command lost, were pushed out of the gate. "Close the gate," Friedrich shouted, blood-drenched. I watched soldiers scramble to turn the winch. The heavy gate slammed down, crushing a Solonian soldier beneath it. Those trapped inside were quickly slaughtered by the vengeful garrison. A surrender that seemed certain was reversed by one man's courage and the soldier's spirit. The gates of old Osric Castle were sealed, the white flag trampled, and the Plantagenet banner raised once more. General Reynard finally arrived on the scene. Seeing the carnage, the fanatical soldiers, and the blood-covered knight, I saw him stand pale and speechless. Who are you?" Reynard stammered. Friedrich ignored him. He dismounted and walked toward the exhausted officers. With unwavering authority, he declared, "I am Friedrich von Schmidt, eldest son of Duke Schmidt, a Tier 4 knight appointed by the king." The officers were stunned. I knew the Schmidt family was the most prominent in the South. "Tell me," Friedrich's gaze cut through them, "your uniforms represent the kingdom's trust. Old Osric Castle holds the hope of millions. Will you bear the shame of traitor and kneel to the barbarians who slaughtered our kin? Do you not owe it to the fallen at Blackstone Pass?" His words struck like hammers, turning their shame into resolve. Friedrich turned to the bloodied soldiers, his tone softening but remaining firm. "I know the kingdom owes you pay. I know you are resentful. It is not your fault." He raised his voice so all could hear. "But I, Friedrich von Schmidt, pledge the honor and wealth of the Schmidt family. If you follow me to hold this castle, I will pay your back wages tenfold, plus 20 gold coins for every man. I swear this on my honor as a knight." The promise of gold and restored honor ignited the soldiers' spirits. Their resentment vanished, replaced by fervor. "We will follow you, my lord. Hold the castle. For gold. For Lord Schmidt. Kill the Solon dogs." Morale soared. The soldiers cheered, pledging loyalty to me, the noble knight who brought them hope and victory. I turned, my gaze icy as I looked at the stunned, ashen-faced General Reynard. "General, your age and recent judgment have led to unwise decisions. I am taking command. You may go rest." Seeing the soldiers' disdain, Reynard couldn't speak. He nodded dejectedly and left, supported by his guards. I knew his authority had vanished the moment the gates were opened. As the eldest son of House Schmidt, I had effectively usurped him through martial prowess and promises of wealth. Standing on the walls of old Osric Castle, I scanned the field. The Solon army had regrouped after their initial shock. Instead of retreating, they began methodically cutting timber to build ladders, shield carts, and heavy battering rams. The air grew heavy with the scent of impending slaughter. The Solonians were clearly enraged. A brutal siege was imminent. I immediately assumed command and began organizing the defense. Loyal officers and soldiers rushed to their posts. Rolling logs were moved, oil was heated, and archers and musketeers checked their dwindling supplies, while civilians repaired fortifications. Before facing the external threat, I knew I had to purge internal dissent. I placed Reynard under house arrest and summoned all senior officials and nobles to the Lord's Hall. They gathered, anxious and confused. Seeing me, the sharp-eyed young knight, in the Lord's seat instead of Reynard, they felt a surge of unease. I spoke coldly. "Solon's surrender letter has shaken morale. Some of you openly advocated surrender, betraying this stronghold and its people. This is treason." My gaze swept the room like a blade, forcing many to look down. "I offer one chance. Those who supported surrender, step forward. Otherwise, if identified, you will be executed for treason." The hall fell into a suffocating silence. The most vocal surrender advocates turned pale and trembled. Under my piercing stare and the angry glares of loyalist officers, they stepped forward. Others were pointed out by their trembling peers. 7 men in total, logistics officers, financiers, and a few cowardly officers, were identified. I showed no mercy. "Seize them." Loyal soldiers rushed in, binding the 7 men. They begged for mercy, crying out for Reynard, who sat silently in defeat. I remained unmoved. "Take them to the square. Execute them for treason and disrupting morale. Hang their heads for 3 days as a warning." Soldiers dragged the struggling men away. Moments later, the sound of blades striking bone echoed across the square, followed by the gasps of the townspeople. This bloody purge shocked the castle into submission, proving my iron-fisted resolve. I had unified the castle, eliminated the surrender faction, and bolstered the morale of the loyalists. I returned to the walls, observing the Solon siege works. The air smelled of blood and smoke. The real war had begun. Meanwhile, at Conford, Hermid's siege had lasted 5 days. The Solonians had remained passive, fortifying their camp as if waiting for something. This calm gave me an opening. I summoned Leon to the Lord's Hall. Leon, the Solonians are too quiet. I want to give them something to do. We will launch a night raid on Hermid's main camp to disrupt their plans and burn their supplies. Leon's eyes lit up. The cavalry is ready. We've been itching for a fight. I nodded. 50 riders aren't enough for a decisive strike. I need more impact. I'm adding Thorstein's Foreign Legion. You will lead 100 men to strike together. Leon was shocked. Sir, that's too risky. Those Solonians surrendered only 2 months ago. If they turn on us or flee, we're doomed. I silenced him. Opportunity waits for no one. I want to hit their commander hard so he never forgets Conford. I trust Thorstein to know what's best for his men. I also believe the fair treatment they've received will earn their loyalty. Execute the order, Leon. Your mission is to cause chaos and burn supplies, then withdraw immediately. Leon saluted. Yes, sir. I then summoned Thorstein. Thorstein was stunned by the order, stepping back in disbelief. Lord, you want me to lead Solon soldiers on a night raid? I patted Thorstein's shoulder firmly. Thorstein, I don't employ those I doubt. Since I spared you and your men, I trust your loyalty. Now is the time to prove your worth. I lowered my voice, adding weight to my words. I know this is difficult, as you face your former kin, but remember, from the moment you surrendered, your fate has been bound to Carnford and to me. If Carnford falls, you all die. Harold will never forgive a traitor. You know what you must do. Thorstein stood stunned. My words hit like a hammer. He knew betrayal meant certain destruction. Yet, he was shocked that I would entrust him with such a mission, a supreme test of faith. His past month flashed before his eyes. From despair to the humiliation of surrender, Carnford had provided food and safety, despite the strict surveillance I had ordered. The Solon tribes offered no place for losers. My unconditional trust awakened a dormant sense of soldierly honor within him. He looked up, his hesitation replaced by resolve. Thorstein gave a crisp Carnford-style salute. My lord, we will not forget your mercy. Tonight, we will fight with everything we have and use Solon blood to prove our loyalty to you and Carnford. May the gods strike us down if we break this oath. I smiled. Good. Pick your bravest men. Tell them, victory means their past crimes are wiped clean, and they shall be rewarded handsomely. Yes, my lord. Thorstein strode away, fueled by newfound determination. Night fell, dark and starless. 3 figures lurked behind a ridge hundreds of meters from my walls. Conrad von Schmidt lowered his telescope, amused. Well, sturdy walls and tight defenses. My little brother Carl has done better than I expected. He frowned at the distant Solon camp. But the trouble is significant. That's no bandit raid. It's the main Solon army. His apprentice, Lena, peeked through the lens and gasped. Teacher, there are so many Solon barbarians surrounding the castle. It's too dangerous. Morian, the other apprentice, was equally shocked. Beyond the camp, he saw the wreckage of shield carts and a field littered with the corpses of men and monsters. The fighting is brutal, Morian noted. The attackers have deployed magical creatures. Conrad nodded, impressed. To hold off an army of this scale in the northern frontier, my brother is far more interesting than I thought. He held up the Starflow scrying mirror, which pulsed with dark energy, pointing toward the heart of the Solon camp. The mirror is clear, Conrad said sharply. A warlock is hiding in that camp, controlling the magical creatures. Conrad chuckled. A fair war shouldn't involve such interference. If the Solons break the rules, my brother deserves a fair compensation. He turned to his apprentices. Lena, Morian, you've memorized the theory. Want to test your spells on a real battlefield? Lena's eyes lit up. Can we really? I've been dying to try my fireball on moving targets. Morian added, combat is the best way to improve. I look forward to testing the ice ray. Excellent. Conrad said, eyeing the camp and my distant castle. But not yet. A good mage waits for the perfect moment, when the enemy is exhausted and their guard is down. He peered into the darkness, envisioning the future. Then, we deliver a fatal blow from the shadows. The three mages waited in the dark, silent hunters anticipating their moment. Inside Carnford, a tense, fanatical energy filled the air. Leon sat atop his black warhorse at the head of the column. Under my precise command, his cavalry had achieved constant success. They struck like ghosts, dealing lethal blows before retreating behind the walls. They had inflicted heavy casualties while maintaining a near-zero casualty rate themselves. Aside from one minor injury treated by Master Andre, all 50 riders were rested and ready. Leon looked back, seeing the burning resolve in his men's eyes. They were battle-hardened, trusting their commander implicitly. They gripped their reins, ready to tear through the darkness at a moment's notice. Leon nodded to them, his pride swelling. Then, his gaze shifted to the flanking unit, and his expression hardened. It was Thorstein's 50-man unit of Solon defectors. Despite my orders, seeing those familiar Solon faces triggered the trauma of his family's slaughter. His home and kin had been destroyed by these very people. Fighting alongside them was a bitter irony. Yet, he knew personal grudges had no place here. The dawn raid required speed and surprise. His 50 men were not enough, but combined with Thorstein's unit, they formed a blade capable of shattering the enemy camp. For Carnford, for survival. Leon suppressed his hatred, his gaze turning cold and resolute. He inhaled the freezing air and signaled Thorstein. A commander must sacrifice his feelings for the sake of victory. Thorstein stood behind him, fully armed. His emotions were complex, but the honor of being trusted by me outweighed everything else. I had not only accepted him, but entrusted him with this vital mission and my own men. This trust filled him with a fierce desire to prove his worth. Tonight, he was no longer a defeated prisoner, but a Carnford knight fighting for his new home. Behind them, 100 elite cavalry waited in the dark. 50 of the riders were Leon's most loyal and fierce northern survivors, their hatred for the Solonians bone deep. The other 50 were Solonian defectors handpicked by Thorstein for their strength and discipline. Once like cavalry in the vanguard battalion, they were now fully armored and armed to the teeth. Maul opened the armory, equipping them with the best chainmail, iron-studded leather, and salvaged plate, alongside sharpened sabers and spears. At dusk, I ordered the remaining smoked meat distributed, giving them a rare, hearty meal. The 50 defectors were deeply stirred. Feeling unprecedented trust and value, the food, gear, and my promise that victory wipes away all past sins ignited their resolve. Having witnessed the Carnford garrison's tenacity and the Solon army's repeated failures against the walls, they knew the truth. Carnford was a fortress that could protect them and offer a future. They were ready to fight for their lord and their home. At 4 a.m., the world was at its darkest and most lethargic. I stood before the troops, scanning their fervent, resolute faces. I spoke clearly, "Warriors, tonight, you are not defenders. You are the blade piercing the enemy's heart. They think us cowards. Show them with your steel and their blood. Carnford never yields. Remember your mission. Sow chaos, burn their supplies, kill their officers, then withdraw. I want no needless sacrifices. Return with victory and glory." The 100 riders remained silent, their emotions like a volcano about to erupt. "Open the gates," I commanded. Soldiers moved the massive support beams and obstacles blocking the gate. The heavy iron-reinforced doors were pushed open just enough for 2 horses to pass. "Move out," Leon roared, leading the charge with Thorstein close behind. The 100 riders flowed out like a stream of steel into the darkness. They maintained a steady trot, stealthily closing the distance to the Solon camp. The Solon camp remained immersed in the deep silence of pre-dawn. Only flickering torches from patrols and distant horse whinnies broke the suffocating stillness. Days of reckless assaults had left the Solon army exhausted. The soldiers were physically drained and mentally numbed by heavy casualties. At this hour, most, including the sentries, were in a state of instinctive relaxation. This was not just physical fatigue, but psychological inertia. The Carnford defenders had always followed a predictable pattern. They relied on fortifications and short counterattacks, never launching large-scale night raids during the darkest hours. The Solonians subconsciously believed that when the sun set, the fighting stopped. They assumed the Plantagenets would never step outside their walls in the dark. This repeated experience had bred a blind sense of security. Consequently, camp security was at its lowest. Sentries dozed off, leaning against fences or watchtowers. Patrols moved sluggishly along fixed, predictable routes. Inside the tents, soldiers slept deeply, trying to recover for the next day's grind. Even the officers rested, convinced this was the safest time. They never imagined this complacency would grant Carnford the perfect opportunity. Death approached in the shadows. Suddenly, a deafening roar shattered the night. The 6-pounder cannon fired. A tongue of fire erupted as a heavy iron ball screamed through the darkness toward the Solon camp. It slammed into the horse stables, collapsing wooden fences amidst screams and panicked neighing. The blast woke the entire camp. Enemy attack. What's happening? Artillery. Soldiers scrambled from their tents in terror, searching for weapons as chaos erupted. Before they could recover, a more terrifying sight appeared in the dim light of the explosion and the breaking dawn. The ground began to tremble. A massive wave of cavalry charged toward their chaotic camp with overwhelming momentum. Leon and Thorstein led the charge like twin spearheads, their horses thundering across the earth. Plantagenet cavalry. Charge! Leon's roar echoed across the battlefield. For Carnford. Kill! Thorstein and his riders joined the war cry, the sound of 100 horses creating a devastating impact. Many Solonians hadn't even found their weapons before the steel tide reached the fences. Einar woke with a start, his heart pounding. He and his comrades grabbed their weapons and rushed outside. They were horrified to see the cavalry tide breaking through the perimeter, sweeping toward the camp's heart. The thundering hooves and war cries filled the air with destructive force. Cavalry. It's the Plantagenet cavalry. Run, a comrade screamed, dropping his weapon to flee. Before he could take a few steps, a stray arrow pierced his chest. He collapsed and died instantly. Einar and the others froze, looking toward the source of the arrow, where Solonian officers stood with bows in hand, eyes filled with murderous intent. Stop! Stand your ground, a scarred centurion roared, drowning out the chaos. Form up. Spearmen front, archers back. Anyone who flees meets the same fate. Despite the surprise attack, I watched the Solonian veterans and officers rely on their discipline to maintain order. Knowing that fleeing from cavalry meant death, they obeyed their officers' fierce commands to form defensive lines. I observed as survival instinct and training overcame their fear. They scrambled to arm themselves with spears and shields, hastily forming dense, small-scale spear formations. I watched Einar, forcing himself to remain calm, don leather armor, grab a spear, and join a formation organized by a scarred centurion. Though I saw his heart race at the sight of a fallen comrade, he abandoned all thoughts of escape. Survival now depended on standing together, though I noted the Plantagenet cavalry had their sights set on higher-value targets. I watched Leon, leading the charge, focus his gaze on the main command tent and the nearby supply stockpiles. Keeping my orders in mind, he remained exceptionally calm despite the adrenaline. Avoid the spear formations. Strike the center. Burn the supplies. I heard Leon roar, leading his main force to bypass the infantry and pierce the heart of the camp. I saw Thorstein's converted Solonian cavalry follow, ignoring the scattered soldiers to trample tents and ignite supply piles with torches. Instantly, I saw the center of the camp engulfed in flames and smoke. I watched Hermod, awakened by the chaos, rush out of his tent half-dressed to investigate. He immediately saw Plantagenet riders breaking through the perimeter, charging directly toward him. I saw the lead knight level his lance at Hermod's chest, the shadow of death looming over him. Paralyzed by fear, I watched Hermod stare at the lethal tip approaching, unable to move. My lord, watch out. I saw a loyal guard lunge forward, shoving Hermod aside just as the lance pierced the guard's chest, lifting him into the air. The guard shrieked as blood sprayed. I watched the rider carry the twitching body for several paces before tossing it aside. I saw Hermod tumble to the ground, disheveled and shaken. Witnessing the carnage and the burning camp, I saw he was filled with disbelief and terror. How? How could there be so many cavalry? I heard him mutter, on the verge of collapse. Intelligence suggested Conford had only a few dozen remnants, but I could see the force before him numbered over 100. Driven by survival instinct, I watched Hermod scramble back into the relative safety of his command tent. Inside, I saw Unag and Mage Thor were pale and panicked. "Commander, what is happening out there?" I heard Unag ask, his voice trembling. I watched Hermod pant, feigning composure. "Don't panic. The guards will protect us soon." Despite the chaos, I saw the Selonian army's resilience begin to show. I watched officers rally the retreating soldiers, pulling them back toward the command tent. Soon, I saw a large, albeit disorganized, defensive perimeter form around the tent, shielding Hermod. I saw Leon and Thorstein's limited numbers forced back by the dense wall of spears and arrows. I knew that cavalry loses its advantage in static melee combat against superior numbers of desperate infantry. I realized the objective to kill the commander seemed out of reach. I saw Leon grow anxious as the enemy regained their footing. I knew that if the Selonians fully reorganized, his 100 riders would be surrounded and annihilated. I watched him reach for his flintlock pistol, preparing to signal a retreat. Just as he raised his arm, I saw a blazing orange fireball streak across the sky, slamming into the densest cluster of soldiers near the command tent. Upon impact, I saw it burst like a ruptured water skin, spraying viscous, liquid fire everywhere. Fire! Help me! I heard screams erupt as the magical flames clung to leather and chain mail alike, burning relentlessly. I watched soldiers roll on the ground and jump into water pits, but the fire refused to extinguish. I saw dozens become human torches, causing the remaining soldiers to break formation in terror. I saw the command tent's canvas catch fire, spreading rapidly. I watched Mage Thor's pupils constrict as he gasped. Enchanted flame. A fireball. They have a formal mage of high caliber. Before he could finish, I saw 3 more fireballs whistle through the air, striking other clusters of soldiers. I saw the magical fire cause mass panic, shattering the defensive formation that had been held together by the officers. I watched soldiers flee in every direction to avoid the inextinguishable flames. Even some Plantagenet riders were singed. I saw them quickly cut away their burning gear to survive, though they were left shaken. I saw Leon, stunned by the magical support, instantly realize this was a golden opportunity. The enemy is in disarray. "Warriors, follow me. Charge the command tent." I heard Leon roar, abandoning the retreat. "Kill." I saw the Plantagenet cavalry's morale surge, replaced by a fanatical desire to fight. I watched them charge like tigers into the chaotic, fire-stricken zone. Hermod, having fled the burning tent, I watched in despair as his lines collapsed and the riders bore down on him. I saw he was pale with fear. "Mage Thor, do something." I heard him scream. I saw Mage Thor, his face dark, realize the enemy mage had ruined his plans. Gritting his teeth, I watched him chant and activate his skull artifact, sending a wave of nauseating, evil energy outward. I heard the air fill with the wails of ghosts, and I saw the magical flames flicker and extinguish under the pressure. I saw the effort cause Mage Thor to cough up blood. Ignoring the pain, I heard him continue his hoarse chant, pointing toward the distance. "Awaken, my servants. Devour everything." As Conrad completed his final incantation, I watched the magical creatures trapped in the valley roar to life, their dormant rage ignited. They shattered the flimsy fences, stampeding toward the camp and shaking the very earth beneath my feet. I observed Thor forced to play his final card to survive. Simultaneously, I saw Leon's cavalry vanguard exploit the chaos of the fireballs to crush the Selonians' line, charging straight at Hermod. I watched Hermod stare into the face of death, witnessing the Plantagenet knight's blade closing in. At this critical moment, I heard a cacophony of roars erupt. The horde of magical creatures arrived, attacking every living soul on the battlefield indiscriminately. I saw Leon's cavalry flank take the brunt of the assault, their momentum stalled by goblins, kobolds, and ghouls. I watched Hermod gasp for air, relieved to have narrowly escaped the cavalry charge. "Commander, we must retreat." I heard Unag urge, grabbing his arm. These monsters are uncontrollable. We must regroup and organize a defense. You are vital to the command. I saw Hermod realize the gravity of the situation. Supported by Onag and his guards, I watched him prepare to withdraw to the rear. Looking back, I saw him struck by despair. The Selonian infantry, having just stabilized their formation, were now being slaughtered from behind. The attackers were the very creatures Thor had summoned. I realized the monsters could not distinguish between Plantagenets and Selonians. To them, I knew all living flesh was merely prey. They swarmed the Selonian infantry, who were caught off guard. "Monsters! Behind us!" I heard them cry. "Why are they attacking us?" "Thor, control them!" I heard them shout. Screams filled the air as I watched the Solon army's defense collapse under the pincer attack. As soldiers trampled one another, I saw a furious Hermod glare at Thor. "What is the meaning of this?" "Sweating and pale," I heard Thor gasp. "It's the price of control. These creatures are imprecise. We've lost. We must flee." I saw Hermod realize the truth in Thor's words. The night raid was a total failure. I knew their only priority now was survival. I watched him flee toward the rear with his guards. As they crossed an open area, I saw a chilling ice ray strike from the shadows. I watched a guard try to shield Hermod, but the ray struck his legs. I heard him shriek as his legs were encased in blue, freezing ice. I watched him collapse with a heavy thud. As the ice spread, I saw him lose all mobility, left only to moan in despair. I watched Hermod and Onag flee in terror. Conrad ignored them, his eyes locked on the true target, the Sorin warlock. I saw Thor sense Conrad's powerful mental lock. Realizing escape was impossible, I watched him turn, his face twisted in defiance. I saw him clutch his skull artifact and begin a frantic chant. "In the name of the abyss, awaken." I heard him cry as the skull's eyes glowed with a blinding crimson light. I saw a violent mental command override the creature's previous instincts. The horde paused, then roared with renewed frenzy, abandoning their current targets. I watched them charge toward the hill where Conrad, Lena, and Morian stood. "Interesting," I heard Conrad remark, observing the scene like a scientific experiment. "The skull is the catalyst for controlling these creatures. A crude but efficient use of abyssal resonance." As the wave approached, I watched Conrad raise his hand and whisper, "Conceal." I saw an invisible ripple envelop him, Lena, and Morian. Their presence and magical signatures vanished instantly before my eyes. Mass invisibility. I saw the creatures lose their target. Confused and agitated, I watched the monsters begin attacking each other. Thor, losing his lock on Conrad, shifted tactics. I watched him press his hand to the ground. Touch of the abyss, Hellcerberus flower, emerge. I heard him shout as 3 monstrous plants erupted from the earth. Their stalks were twisted tentacles, topped with tooth-filled flowers dripping corrosive slime. I realized these Hellcerberus flowers sensed the life energy within the invisibility field. I watched them spit streams of searing green flame at the empty air. "Watch out," I shouted. I watched Conrad shove Lena and Morian aside, diving clear himself. I saw the green flames scorch the ground where they had stood. I saw Conrad frown and dispel the invisibility. "Simple concealment won't work," I heard Conrad say, dusting off his robes. "Let's try a more direct approach." I watched him chant an ancient incantation. I saw arcane energy coalesce into a shimmering blue arcane blade. I watched Conrad strike with lightning speed, aiming for Thor. I saw Thor's eyes widen. He hadn't expected a mage to wield a melee weapon with such tier 3 proficiency. I watched him retreat, blocking the strike with his skull artifact, creating a shower of sparks and magical turbulence. Staggering back, I saw Thor bite his tongue and spray blood onto the skull. Soulrot curse. I saw a black cloud of decay form above Conrad. I watched negative energy lightning crackle, attempting to erode Conrad's mind. I heard Conrad scoff, forming a circular rune with his left hand. Mind barrier. A translucent, diamond-shaped shield appeared above me, its surface etched with arcane runes protecting me and my 2 apprentices. Instantly, a bolt of dark energy lightning struck the shield with a deafening crack. The shield rippled violently but held firm, dissipating the black electrical snakes without allowing them to penetrate. Mage Thor's expression soured. I realized his best curse magic had been effortlessly blocked. His opponent's mastery far exceeded his own. Facing certain death, he clutched his skull artifact and chanted his final survival spell. Shadow Shift, Blood Contract Displacement. Unag, return. As the spell finished, Thor vanished into a cloud of black mist. I immediately thrust my sword into the center of the fog. The blade met little resistance, piercing through something with an eerie, sluggish sensation. Simultaneously, the black mist dissipated as if stirred by an invisible hand. My pupils contracted as I realized what I had struck, stopping my blade mid-thrust, though it was already embedded deep. I had not hit Thor, but the sullen officer, Onag, who stared down at the sword in his abdomen in utter confusion and terror. Gasping for air, Onag could only emit a wheezing sound as his life faded. I realized, shadow displacement via blood contract? A cunning trick. I underestimated this amateur warlock. I spotted Thor flickering into existence hundreds of meters away before vanishing into the shadows again. Master, shall we pursue? Morian asked, gathering ice energy. I shook my head. No, he's gone. Since he serves the Solan army, we will have plenty of chances to settle this later. Above, the cursed storm clouds continued to pelt the shield with dull, thudding strikes. Lena asked worriedly, Master, shouldn't we dispel the curse? Maintaining the shield must be exhausting. I dismissed it casually. This soul-rot curse is malicious. Dispelling it forcefully could cause a backlash. Let it strike. The energy will deplete soon. Consider this a live lesson in defensive stillness overcoming motion. I snapped my fingers, and the shield glowed more intensely. Ignoring the lightning, I expressionlessly withdrew my sword from Onag's body. The magic-infused blade dissolved into black smoke upon leaving the corpse, as if it had never existed. Only a gruesome, bleeding wound remained on Onag. Mage Thor's desperate attempt to summon monsters for self-protection inadvertently created a perfect opening for Leon and Thorstein's Plantagenet cavalry. The goblins and ghouls harassing the cavalry's flanks abandoned their targets, roaring as they charged toward Thor's location. The cavalry's pressure vanished, allowing them to disengage. For the Solan infantry, however, this was a disaster. The monsters, losing track of me, turned their aggression toward the nearest targets, the Solonians. The monster horde crashed into the Solan lines like a tidal wave, tearing into the unsuspecting soldiers. Screams and the sounds of carnage drowned out the battlefield. Caught between the Plantagenet cavalry and the rampaging monsters, the Solan army collapsed. Discipline and formations vanished instantly. Run, they cried. Monsters. They're everywhere. It's over. Panic spread like a plague. Soldiers discarded weapons and trampled comrades, fleeing blindly toward the rear. Any officer attempting to restore order was either trampled by the stampede or torn apart by the pursuing monsters. Leon watched the sudden, dramatic collapse in a daze. The formidable defensive line he had been struggling to break was now a chaotic hellscape of slaughter. Had the Solonians truly been defeated so quickly? Leon had only ever known the Plantagenet kingdom to be the one suffering such routs. Failure and sacrifice had long been the heavy shackles on the northern frontier. They had fought out of desperate instinct, never daring to dream of actually defeating these seemingly invincible barbarians. Yet, history had turned. The Solan army, which had loomed over Con Ford like an iron flood, was now disintegrating in a pathetic, chaotic rout. The orderly lines were gone, replaced by a sea of screaming, panicked men. Even the fierce Solan berserkers had lost their ferocity, replaced by the raw fear of death. They cast aside their battle axes and shields, pushing and trampling their own to escape the Plantagenet cavalry. The disciplined regular soldiers were no better, their formations completely shattered. Officers' shouts were swallowed by the panic. Any attempt to resist resulted in being cut down or trampled by their own fleeing men. The Solonians knew fear after all. Their courage was not infinite. When death arrived, they broke just like anyone else. A mix of ecstatic joy and disbelief washed over Leon. His hand trembled on his lance. He stood momentarily paralyzed. Thorstein rode up, urgent and firm. Lord Leon, Lord Karl orders us to pursue. Look at the ramparts. Leon snapped to attention, looking toward the main tower of Confort. The signalman was waving a massive red flag. Full pursuit. Expand the victory. Thorstein urged, "My lord, the opportunity is fleeting. We must not let them regroup. Give the order." Thorstein's words struck Leon like a lightning bolt. He had been hesitating at the critical moment. Feeling a surge of shame and urgency, he looked at Thorstein, his former enemy, now his most reliable comrade, with gratitude. No more hesitation. Leon fired his flintlock pistol into the air. The sharp crack cut through the battlefield noise, signaling the cavalry. "Warriors of Plantagenet." Leon roared, his voice hoarse with excitement. "The Sullan barbarians have broken. Follow me. Pursue the remnants. Let their blood forge the legend of Conford's invincibility. For victory. Charge. For victory. Kill them all." Hearing the order to pursue and Leon's roar, the cavalry, already bloodthirsty and at peak morale, let out a fanatical cry. Their fighting spirit blazed like a wildfire. Meanwhile, outside Conford, I personally led a mixed formation, marching steadily toward the city gates in a disciplined assault array. I selected 2 elite, veteran combat soldier platoons as the core, supported by 2 militia platoons awaiting their first real test. 120 soldiers marched under the moonlight, their armor and spear tips gleaming coldly. I observed the chaotic battlefield. I had just witnessed Leon and Thorstein's cavalry shatter the enemy's flank like a hot knife through butter. They were now relentlessly hunting down the fleeing enemy, further scattering their ranks. Though the origin of the fireball that disrupted the enemy command was unknown, it had turned a potentially disastrous night raid into a decisive victory. I ordered my cavalry to continue the pursuit and led my infantry out of the city to expand the advantage. With the enemy main force routed, this was a perfect opportunity for the high morale militia to gain combat experience under controlled conditions. "Blow the horn. Advance," I commanded. The trumpeters sounded the advance, and the infantry moved forward with disciplined, heavy steps. Squad leaders used short whistles and concise commands to maintain spacing and speed, ensuring a tight, orderly line. The rhythmic sound of heavy boots and clashing armor created an intimidating aura. The militia platoons, however, were slightly disorganized. They struggled with the complex whistle signals, sometimes needing veteran guidance, and their pace fluctuated. Fortunately, they were positioned behind and to the sides of the veterans. Influenced by the stoic, synchronized veterans, the militia suppressed their nerves and mimicked the movements of the seasoned soldiers. Gradually, the initial chaos subsided, and their formation tightened, gaining a burgeoning sense of martial sharpness. I monitored the battlefield while observing my troops' progress. I was not surprised by the militia's awkwardness. As long as they held formation and followed orders, it was a success. Leon had discarded his lance, his saber was notched, and his armor was stained with gore. After cutting down the last few goblins, he used his horse's momentum to break through the encirclement. He reined in his panting horse and scanned the chaotic, nightmarish scene. The pursuit had devolved into a series of isolated, desperate skirmishes. At least a dozen of his men were trapped by the monsters after overextending their pursuit of the Solonians. The mindless goblins and ghouls ignored casualties, clawing at the horses and armor to drag the riders down. Leon watched in horror as a cavalryman was pulled into the monster tide and vanished. Damn it! Leon felt a chill of panic. The Solonians were no longer the primary threat. The out-of-control monsters were. He shouted, "Don't get bogged down. Rally to me. Break out." He charged back into the fray to rescue his men. Thorstein and his Sullan cavalry also broke through the monster swarm, looking battered as they joined Leon. Thorstein quickly assessed the dire situation. Leon pointed toward the fleeing Solonians and urged, "Thorstein, look. The Sullan main force is routed, but not destroyed. If we waste our strength on these mindless monsters, the Solonians will regroup once they realize we aren't pursuing them. If they counterattack while we are exhausted and trapped, the consequences will be dire. We cannot waste time here." Leon regained his composure. "The priority is to rally our forces and break out of this encirclement. We must escape these monsters, then hunt down the Solonians like shadows, giving them no chance to regroup." Thorstein agreed, adding his own tactical advice while fending off a ghoul. "Your judgment is correct, but we shouldn't engage them in close quarters yet. Our numbers are too low. Forcing a fight might make them turn and stand their ground. We should herd them like sheep, staying 100 to 150 paces behind, harassing them with arrows and constant shouting to keep them in a state of panic. They will exhaust themselves fleeing. Once their morale and formation collapse, we strike like thunder for the final blow. Leon's eyes lit up at the sound strategy. They signaled the remaining cavalry to rally and disengage. The cavalry broke free from the monsters and regrouped, moving like trained hounds. They kept a distance, acting as lethal shadows trailing the fleeing Solonians. The Solonians, thinking they had escaped, tried to slow down to catch their breath. Suddenly, Plantagenet cavalry horns and musket fire would erupt on their left, with arrows forcing them to veer right. As they shifted right, Thorstein's Solon cavalry would accelerate to intercept. Using terrifying war cries in the Solon language, they would execute any stragglers with lassos. This forced the Solonians to keep running in terror, never finding a moment of respite. Meanwhile, my infantry phalanx engaged the blood-stained monsters. Facing these inhuman, foul-smelling creatures, I calmly employed the Mandarin duck formation. The infantry was organized into 10 independent squads. Each squad acted as a small fortress, spaced 10 paces apart, allowing for both independent action and mutual support. At the front were 2 shield bearers in heavy armor, serving as the foundation of the formation. Behind them, each shield bearer was supported by 2 pikemen, who thrust their spears through gaps in the shields to maintain a lethal reach. Between the pikemen stands a soldier with a tongpa, a trident-like weapon with side branches used for stabbing, blocking, and trapping enemy arms. At the rear, 2 musketeers handle ranged fire and sudden threats. 2 auxiliary soldiers with head-severing knives bring up the rear, tasked with harvesting Solonian heads and protecting the musketeers. The squad leader stands at the center, observing the battlefield and issuing commands. The monsters, noticing the organized formation, abandoned their feast and charged my phalanx with bloodthirsty roars. I stood at the rear, sword raised. Halt! Hold the line. Officers repeated my order, steadying the new recruits. Hold! Trust your brothers. Shields up, spears ready. The monsters slammed into them with a thunderous crash. The shield bearers took the brunt of the impact, bracing their shoulders against the shields, short swords ready. Some monsters wedged their weapons into the wooden shields, becoming trapped. As the impact hit, I watched the pikemen strike. Thrust. Roderick drove his spear through a goblin's chest. The dying goblin grabbed the shaft, preventing Roderick from pulling it back. The goblin threw a poisoned dagger at Roderick's face. Roderick was trapped and unable to dodge. Clang! Oliver, the tongpa bearer, deflected the dagger with his weapon's side branch. Roderick thanked him and yanked his spear free, coated in gore. A ghoul leaped over the shield wall, charging squad leader William. Oliver stepped in, catching the ghoul's rusted cleaver with his tongpa. William drew his sword to counterattack. Roderick pierced the ghoul's neck from the side. A kobold tried to flank, but was silenced by a gunshot. Musketeer Mark had blown its skull apart. I watched similar scenes play out across all 10 Mandarin duck formations. The monster's charge was shattered by the coordinated, multi-layered formation. Their numbers were neutralized as they were forced into isolated skirmishes. Pikemen, shield bearers, tongpa bearers, and musketeers worked in perfect, disciplined harmony. The monsters broke against the wall of steel, suffering heavy losses. My phalanx moved forward like a machine, leaving a trail of corpses. Simultaneously, a silent harvest began. Auxiliary soldiers followed the advance, eyeing the fallen Solonian soldiers. Though I didn't mandate head counting, enemy heads remained the standard currency for military merit. Each head represented bounty, promotion, and security for their families. The auxiliaries competed silently to ensure their squad's claims were secured. They moved like leopards, drawing their head-severing knives. The blades sliced through necks with chilling efficiency. They showed no mercy to the wounded, finishing them off instantly. Swift strikes to vital points ensured the targets were dead and prevented counterattacks. The process was numbingly efficient. The soldiers focused solely on their spoils. They tied heads to their belts or stuffed them into bags before moving to the next target. The air grew thick with the stench of blood and death. It was a brutal, primitive display of war's utilitarian nature, driven by survival and greed. As dawn broke, the battlefield was revealed. The ground before Conford was littered with corpses. Thousands of monsters and headless Solonian soldiers lay in a pool of dark blood. I surveyed the scene, unsurprised by the minimal casualties. I knew that disciplined formations would always crush uncoordinated monsters and disorganized troops. Discipline and tactics were the ultimate weapons. Battle over. Clean the field, I ordered. The formation dissolved as soldiers swarmed the bodies. The heads had already been collected. Now they hunted for valuables. They stripped the Solonian officers of rings, daggers, and armor. They targeted high-ranking gear and purses. The looting followed a strict, pre-assigned order to prevent internal fighting. Soldiers worked with practiced speed in their designated zones. They ignored the blood splattered on their faces and armor. Their eyes burned with exhaustion and greed as they searched for anything of value. The clinking of coins occasionally broke the silence of the looting. I watched, ensuring order was maintained. I shouted one final warning. Stay alert. Watch for those playing dead. To me, this gruesome post-battle scavenging was a necessary part of forging a ruthless, iron-blooded army. This brutal blood education effectively suppresses my soldiers' aversion to slaughter, hardening their battlefield resolve without inciting internal chaos. I tolerate this disorder, viewing it as a necessary evil for maintaining military efficiency. Soon, I watched as soldiers began looting valuables, their pouches bulging with spoils. New recruits, unaccustomed to the visceral reality of close-quarters killing, struggled with nausea. Yet, driven by veteran influence and the allure of rewards, even the novices quickly grew numb and efficient. I headed toward a quiet hill, eager to identify the mysterious ally who had turned the tide. I had watched from the walls as Leon's cavalry struggled against the disciplined Solonians, nearly facing encirclement. Without those precise fireballs shattering the Solon line, I knew Leon's forces would have been annihilated. That intervention was decisive. Near the hill, the mage stood in deep contemplation, observing the cursed black lightning while recording observations in a notebook. Two apprentices stood by, curiously surveying the busy Carnford castle. The female student nudged the mage, drawing his attention to me. The mage turned, and I finally saw his face clearly. He was around 30, handsome, with pale skin and a sharp, intellectual gaze. A strange sense of familiarity stirred in me. The man's eyes and features felt hauntingly recognizable. We locked eyes in a silent, penetrating stare. The air grew heavy, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the battlefield and rolling thunder. The apprentices watched the exchange with growing curiosity. The mage broke the silence with a subtle, knowing smile. "Carl," he said with a hint of irony, "have I been away so long that you don't recognize your own brother?" My mind raced, frantically searching my memories. "Are you Friedrich?" I asked tentatively. The mage shook his head. "Friedrich is your eldest brother, the one aiming to be a fifth-rank knight." "Then, Caspar," the mage chuckled. "Caspar is your second brother, the king's court scholar in the royal capital." I laughed awkwardly, feigning confidence. "I knew it was you, brother." I took a breath and uttered the name. "Conrad." I finally remembered my third brother, Conrad von Schmidt, a prodigy in magic. Conrad had been taken by a wandering archmage to a northern tower during my youth, and we had rarely spoken since. I never expected to see him here, on the dangerous northern frontier. "Brother," I stepped forward. "Welcome to Carnford." "Thank you. Without you, we would have been lost." Conrad offered a rare, faint smile. He gestured to the lightning above. "No hugs, Carl. I'm carrying a parting gift from that Soren warlock, a soul-rot curse that's currently unstable." I stopped, nodding in understanding. "Safety first." I turned to the apprentices. "And thank you both for your help." Lena performed a mage's salute. "I'm Lena, Lord Carl. Glad to be of service." Morian bowed. "Morian, my lord. Your castle is far more orderly and fortified than I imagined." He seemed genuinely surprised by the state of the fortress. "Desperation breeds potential," I replied coolly. I glanced down at the corpse of Unag. Conrad followed my gaze to the dead Solonian officer. "A clumsy mistake," Conrad explained apologetically. "The Soren warlock used a displacement spell in his panic. He swapped places with this officer. My blade was meant for the warlock. He shrugged. It ended up like this. I waved it off, eyeing the corpse like a commodity. It doesn't matter. I just need a high-ranking head to boost morale. His will suffice. The apprentices shivered at my cold, utilitarian tone. Lena whispered to Morian. Father was right. The northern frontier is a brutal, terrifying place. Morian nodded, eyeing me with newfound caution. Conrad observed his students' reactions, but said nothing, offering me a complex, knowing look. He understood that in this harsh land, survival required shedding unnecessary pity. My brother clearly saw that I had learned that lesson well. I gestured toward the castle. The stench of blood is too strong here. Please, join me inside. Conrad agreed. I have things to discuss with you. We walked through the corridor into the castle, the apprentices observing the surroundings. While not luxurious, the castle was well-maintained, sturdy, and clean. Despite their exhaustion, the soldiers and subjects displayed a resilient, vibrant spirit. I didn't expect such vitality in the north, Lena whispered. We reached the main hall, which had been tidied up. I offered them seats and refreshments. Conrad, your fireballs were perfectly timed. They shattered the Solonians' formation. Conrad waved off the praise. Enough pleasantries. I came to see your progress, but primarily to investigate that Soren warlock. I grew serious. The one controlling the magical creatures? Yes, Conrad said, his eyes gleaming with scholarly interest. His artifact uses a crude but efficient method of amplifying magical contracts, a fascinating subject for my research. I nodded thoughtfully. I understand. How can I help you? Conrad replied concisely. Since the warlock serves the Solon army, he will reappear when the Solonians launch another large-scale attack, likely using even stronger magic. I need you to provoke the Solonians into attacking Carnford with sufficient force, forcing the warlock to reveal himself and use more of his power. I was speechless at this request. I preferred the Solonians to ignore me, not to invite a suicidal confrontation. However, given Conrad's recent contributions, I felt compelled to agree. After a pause, I asked, Conrad, can you subdue him or obtain the research samples you need when he appears? Conrad raised his chin confidently. If he uses that artifact, I have a 70% chance of analyzing its energy patterns or finding a way to destroy it, provided your army creates the right battlefield conditions. I tapped the table, deep in thought. The risks were high, but success meant eliminating the warlock, crushing Solonian morale, and advancing Conrad's research. I looked up, resolute. Agreed. We will provoke them into attacking. We must plan the timing and tactics carefully, no blind actions. Conrad nodded. Naturally. You are the commander. I only need a chance to observe and interact with him at close range. Meanwhile, on the wilderness road to the Solon camp, a brutal pursuit neared its end. I watched as Leon and Thorstein led their cavalry, stalking the retreating Solon soldiers like patient wolves. After a 5-kilometer chase, the 1,000-strong force was on the verge of total collapse from exhaustion and psychological pressure. Many Solon soldiers collapsed, unable to rise. Those who surrendered were swiftly executed. The remaining 700 or 800 stumbled like dying prey. Leon and Thorstein's cavalry maintained a steady pace, conserving their horses' energy while coldly observing the enemy's despair. Thorstein felt a complex mix of emotions watching his former comrades. It was a flicker of nostalgia, quickly replaced by a sense of finality. He thought, "Forgive me, but I have sworn loyalty to Lord Karl. Our future is paved with your blood. This is our pledge of allegiance." He turned to Leon. "Lord Leon, the time has come. They are spent, and our horses are rested. Let us end this hunt." Leon, eyes burning with long-suppressed hatred, saw the chaos among the Solonians. He drew his blood-stained saber and roared, "Now, charge! Kill them all! Leave no one alive! Kill!" The cavalry surged forward like a broken dam, crashing into the defenseless remnants. It was a total massacre. Leon led the charge, cleaving a soldier in two. The blood on his face brought him a grim sense of satisfaction. He remembered the dark years of the northern frontier, when Plantagenet citizens were slaughtered by Solon iron hoofs. His father's adjutant, an old northern knight, had died in just such a desperate retreat. Over a decade of humiliation erupted. For Plantagenet, for the northern frontier, Leon shouted, his strikes fueled by rage as his horse trampled the fallen. Thorstein and his defectors fought with equal ferocity, needing to prove their loyalty to me. They cut down their former comrades, severing their past identities with every blow. The Solon soldiers, devoid of fighting spirit, lacked the strength even to flee. They wailed in despair, some kneeling to beg, others closing their eyes to await the blades and maces. Pleas were ignored. Leon's cavalry showed no mercy. Heads were severed, and the wilderness filled with the sounds of slaughter. The massacre was efficient and brief. Within 15 minutes, the field fell silent, save for the horses' breathing and the groans of the dying. The ground was carpeted with corpses. Blood soaked the parched earth, filling the air with a nauseating stench. Leon pulled his horse to a halt, covered in gore. He looked toward the rising sun in the east. The sunlight felt cleansing. He took a deep breath, imagining his father's face. He whispered internally, "Father, do you see? I have washed away the shame of the northern frontier with Solonian blood and avenged you. Rest in peace. The northern frontier will be ours again." The soldiers began clearing the field. The corpses were buried in deep pits to prevent plague. The severed heads of the Solonians were preserved. To me, these were strategic assets, proof of victory to secure rewards or political support. With the royal treasury strained, these heads served as valuable gifts for powerful allies like Count Rochefort. Count Rochefort needed such results to prove the value of northern defense to the kingdom and secure supplies. Alternatively, they could be traded with inland lords for gold and provisions needed by Carnford. By noon, the task was complete. In the distance, the rhythmic sound of hooves approached. Leon and Thorstein's cavalry appeared on the horizon, returning in triumph to Carnford Castle. I rushed forward, relieved to see the returning cavalry. Though bloodied and exhausted, the cavalry maintained formation, showing no signs of heavy attrition. Each saddle was adorned with severed Solon heads, a grim testament to the brutal pursuit. The unit halted before the castle. Leon and Thorstein dismounted and saluted me. Despite their fatigue, their eyes burned with the triumph of a completed mission. "Commander," Leon reported, his voice raspy, "we pursued the Solon retreat 5 kilometers out. Of the 800 enemies, we confirmed 674 kills. The rest fled into the mountains." He reported the casualties: 10 lightly wounded, 3 heavily wounded, and 5 dead. Leon's voice dipped as he noted the 5 deaths, which occurred during the night raid when soldiers were isolated by monsters. I felt a surge of joy and relief. The daring night raid had decimated Hermod's vanguard, burning supplies and neutralizing nearly 1,000 men. Combined with the wall defense, total kills exceeded 1,300, while our core cavalry remained largely intact. "Excellent," I exclaimed, patting their shoulders. "You've done a magnificent job." I praised Leon specifically. Your ability to set aside personal grievances and cooperate with Thorstein secured this victory. You are a true commander. Leon nodded at Thorstein, replying, "I only did my duty as a knight and officer." I turned to Thorstein. "Your actions proved your valor and loyalty. You were vital to this pursuit. From today, you and your cavalry are no longer surrendered troops, but an essential part of the Carnford army. I expect great things from you." Thorstein's chest heaved with emotion. He saluted sharply. "I swear my life to you and Carnford. I will not fail you." I dismissed them to rest and eat, promising rewards later. The men cheered and headed toward the camp. 3 days later, at Ulf's command tent outside Friend City, the atmosphere was frigid. Hermod knelt on the rug, his armor caked in blood and mud, his face a mask of fear and frustration. He kept his head bowed, avoiding Ulf's gaze. Ulf leaned forward, his expression stormy. He stared intensely at Hermod. Silence filled the tent, save for the crackling fire. Hermod spoke hoarsely. "Commander, we failed. We besieged Carnford and unleashed the monsters as planned." He shifted blame. "The defenses were too strong, and they had hundreds of elite cavalry that harassed us, allowing their wall defenders to rotate and rest." He exaggerated the cavalry numbers to excuse his failure. Hermod continued, "The monsters were uncontrollable, attacking friend and foe alike. so we couldn't provide support. And they had a heavy artillery piece. Hermod added, his voice rising in panic. We used reinforced shield carts, but they were useless. When we reached within 100 meters, they fired. The first cart was obliterated, killing a dozen men instantly. Their gunners were terrifyingly fast. They destroyed the rest of our carts. Without cover, our soldiers were slaughtered by muskets and arrows. Hermod then addressed the night raid. They sent 500 cavalry to burn our camp. He claimed his men had nearly stabilized the situation. But then, they used mages, 3 of them. One used fireballs, another froze my guard solid. The third was an invisible assassin with magical blades. It wasn't my incompetence, but their dark sorcery. He concluded by blaming poor intelligence for the lack of preparation. Ulf smirked coldly at the pathetic excuses. So, the failure is mine? My lack of troops or bad intelligence? Ulf roared. You had 2,000 men and thousands of monsters. Against a new border fort? You lost your camp and your vanguard. Where was your command? Hermod trembled, kowtowing frantically. I am incompetent. I deserve death. Ulf struggled to contain his rage. He realized killing Hermod now would be counterproductive. Hermod had been loyal and brave in the past. Ulf finally spoke. You failed, and you lied. I will spare your life for now. Hermod felt a flicker of relief. You are stripped of your rank and demoted to a centurion in the vanguard battalion. You will lead the next assault. If you retreat or lie again, you will be executed. Get out. Thank you, Commander, for sparing my life. I will serve you with my death to atone for my failure. Hermod kowtowed frantically before scrambling out of the tent, drenched in cold sweat. I watched his pathetic retreat with disgust and exhaustion. I rubbed my brow, realizing the war for Conford was far more troublesome than I had anticipated. Though Hermod was unreliable, I believed his report of Conford's formidable cavalry and mages was likely true. As Hermod fled, the heavy tent flap fell, sealing out the light and noise. The tent returned to a tense silence, broken only by the crackle of charcoal. I turned my gaze toward Mage Thor, who stood in the shadows. Unlike Hermod's frantic state, Thor appeared physically drained. His dark robes were scorched and dust-covered. His face was deathly pale, his eyes sunken and dim, as if his magic was depleted. He leaned heavily on his staff for support. Sensing my gaze, Thor bowed and rasped, "Commander." I gestured for him to continue. Thor spoke with cold, factual precision. Hermod's report on the battle is accurate. Conford's defenses far exceed our estimates. My army of 10,000 monsters failed to breach a single brick of their outer wall all morning. Thor admitted with frustration. Their defense is tight, with well-placed siege weapons, archers, muskets, and cannons forming a dense, interlocking fire. The defenders are disciplined and experienced. They are no mere rabble. I frowned, cutting him off. Hermod said all that. Tell me the key. What about the 3 mages? I needed to know the variable that caused the collapse. Thor shifted to the core issue. Hermod was right. The enemy has mages, and they are significant. 2 used fireballs and frost. Their technique is amateur, likely apprentices or first-tier mages. They are manageable. Thor's tone darkened. The third, however, is dangerous. The one who uses invisibility and conjures magic blades. Their control is masterful. Those blades are sharp and solid. I judge this person to be above a 3rd-tier mage. Above 3rd tier? My eyes narrowed. That was a strategic-level threat in the Plantagenet kingdom. Thor nodded. Given the surname of the Lord of Conford, Karl von Schmidt, I suspect this mage is his brother, Konrad von Schmidt, who was recruited by a northern mage tower years ago. That explains why such a remote place has such a powerful guardian. I fell silent, my eyes sharp. I had seen the name Konrad von Schmidt in my intelligence files. The world viewed the Solonians as mere savages, but I knew better. The Solon tribe valued intelligence and infiltration above all. The old chieftain often took fortresses through espionage and bribery rather than costly frontal assaults. Harold had inherited and expanded this tradition. He maintained a vast, efficient intelligence network within the Plantagenet kingdom. Every noble, general, and mage of note was cataloged, analyzed, and tracked for weaknesses. If Thor was right, Conford was not just a border fort, but a node of a much larger, complex power. I looked at Thor. What is your status? Can you continue? Thor replied bitterly. Controlling the monsters drained me, and my brief clash with the mage I suspect is Conrad resulted in a backlash. His mental power is like an abyss. I am depleted and need long-term meditation. I cannot provide effective support in the short term. My expression darkened further. Without a mage, the siege would be even harder. But I knew Thor had done his best. I decided to offer a concession. I understand. You have worked hard, Mage Thor. I will grant you 200 strong slaves from the camp to help you recover your strength. I knew well that warlocks could drain life force to accelerate recovery. Thor bowed, a complex look in his eyes. Thank you, Commander. I will recover as quickly as possible. Thor bowed again and retreated, his steps unsteady. Alone, I stared at the fire, contemplating how to handle the thorn that was Conford. It was bleeding my resources and stalling my momentum. This cannot continue, I thought. The Lord of Conford had become the greatest obstacle to my southern raid. I had never faced such a persistent opponent before. I had to resolve this quickly to avoid future disaster. I turned to my cold, rugged captain, Fenhern. Fenhern. I am here. Fenhern stepped forward, radiating killing intent. I commanded. I appoint you commander of the Conford front. Take 2,000 scan cavalry and 2,000 reinforcements from the Frostguard garrison. Your mission is to surround Conford so tightly that not even a mouse can escape. Ulf pointed at the map, ordering his subordinate. Remember, surround Conford, but do not attack. Reinforce the camp, deploy scouts, and cut off all their communications. Do not launch any major offensives without my orders. Your task is to starve and exhaust them until the time is right. Fenhern saluted. Understood, Legion Commander. I guarantee not a single soul will escape Conford. Ulf waved him away. Watching Fenhern leave, Ulf sat back and rubbed his throbbing temples. Withdrawing 2,000 elites from the siege of France City and adding 2,000 reinforcements to contain remote Conford was a desperate gamble. It was like breaking 2 fingers from a clenched fist, weakening the pressure on France City and splitting his forces across 2 distant fronts. Ulf knew this movement couldn't be hidden from the experienced defenders of France City or the cunning Count Rochefort. Once the Count sensed the loosening of the encirclement, he would surely reorganize his defenses or send elites to harass Harold's raiding party deep in the kingdom. This would inevitably disrupt Harold's plans. This will be used against me during the post-war reckoning, Ulf mused, imagining Harold's cold, oppressive gaze. Weakening the siege of a key target could lead to severe punishment. But he had no choice. The stubborn hill fortress of Conford haunted him. With its mages, cavalry, and the seemingly unkillable me, leaving such a hostile thorn near his supply lines was like burying a powder keg behind his own back. Its potential threat far outweighed the temporary relaxation of the siege on France City. I must use overwhelming force to seal them off completely, Ulf concluded. Risks had to be minimized. He looked toward the northern shadows where Conford lay, his eyes cold. Let you linger a while longer, he whispered. When Harold returns victorious with the riches and slaves of Plantagenet. He clenched his fist until his knuckles cracked. That is when our Solon alliance will crush your fortress and everyone inside into dust. All this restraint would be repaid with Conford's total destruction. In the governor's mansion at France City, Count Rochefort stood before a map, tapping the ruby marker for the city. Ulf had been besieging the city for a month. Though there was no direct assault, the blockade kept the atmosphere suffocating. A scout rushed in, breathless. My lord, there is abnormal movement in the Solon camp. The Scan cavalry, who have been hunting our knights, are pulling back in large numbers. Their formation is chaotic. What? The Count looked up, startled. Was this a trap, or had something gone wrong in Ulf's rear? He dropped his baton and commanded, saddle up, to the walls. He strode out of the mansion, followed by his personal guards. They rode through the quiet, heavily guarded streets to the main wall. The Count dismounted and climbed to the ramparts. The soldiers on the wall were watching the Solon camp with nervous anticipation. The telescope. The Count took the brass instrument from a guard. He adjusted the focus, peering deep into the Solon camp. Indeed, dust was rising in the rear. The Scan cavalry, usually deployed to intercept messengers, were abandoning their posts and gathering in the rear. Nearly 2,000 cavalry were mobilizing. This was no routine patrol. The Count frowned, calculating. Was Ulf planning a flanking maneuver, or was he facing a crisis? A sudden, bold realization struck the Count. He looked toward the north, toward that thorn he feared would be crushed. Confort. It must be him. The Count felt a mix of shock, joy, and relief. Karl, it's Karl von Schmidt. Only he could create miracles in such desperate situations. His fingers trembled with excitement. The logic was clear. Ulf wouldn't move his key cavalry unless his rear was under existential threat. Who else in the north could cause such trouble for Ulf? I hadn't just held Confort. I had gone on the offensive, striking like a dagger into Solon's soft underbelly. I must have defeated the forces sent against me or attacked the supply lines, forcing Ulf to pull back his elites. Even though he was used to my miracles, the Count was deeply shaken, realizing that I had not only survived but was actively disrupting the siege of a 10,000-strong army left the seasoned governor stunned. Good lad, the Count whispered, smiling. You never disappoint. He turned to his messenger. Order the army to heighten vigilance and monitor the Solonians. Since the scan cavalry is moving, our pressure is reduced. Send our best scouts to contact Blackstone Pass. I need to know the situation there. Quickly. Father. It must be Karl. Charlotte appeared, grabbing his arm, her blue eyes shining with excitement. Quick. While they are in disarray, send our cavalry out to pincer them. We can win. Otherwise, Confort will be in danger. The Count's face darkened as he saw his daughter on the dangerous wall. Nonsense. Who let you up here? Get down. Father, this is the chance. Karl is risking everything to help us. We cannot just watch. The Count looked at his daughter, his expression complex. Count Rockefort knew I was likely behind the chaos and wanted to strike, but as a commander, he had to remain calm. He forced himself to suppress his impulses. He stared coldly at the Solon camp. I know Confort likely drew their forces, but Charlotte, you're missing the real trap. He pointed to the rear of the Solon camp. Look. Ulf's elite heavy cavalry hasn't moved an inch. Ulf is letting his light cavalry waste time circling around rather than deploying his decisive iron fist. He's feigning weakness to lure me into a reckless pursuit or an attempt to link up with Karl. The Count was firm. Once our main cavalry leaves the protection of the walls, Ulf's heavy cavalry will ambush us. We would be slaughtered in the open, and France City would be left defenseless. We cannot take that risk. He handed the telescope to his daughter, pointing at the retreating Skarn light cavalry. Look, they are only light cavalry, mobile but weak in sieges. This proves they failed to take Confort and lack the equipment to continue. Karl is actually safer now than when he was surrounded. Charlotte took the telescope, looking on with skepticism. Indeed, the riders were lightly equipped and carried no siege gear. She relaxed, though she felt embarrassed by her earlier impulsiveness. The Count glared at her, then turned to the nearby scouts and officers, his voice icy. Everything seen today, especially regarding the Northern Front and Confort, is top secret. Any leaks will be treated as treason under military law. Understood. Understood, my lord. The soldiers replied in unison. Charlotte returned home, feeling lost. The events on the wall left her with complex emotions. Knowing I was safe and had successfully diverted the enemy filled her with pride and longing. I had once again performed a miracle. Yet, a deep worry remained. My actions were a slap in the face to the Solonians, who would not let it slide. A brutal retaliation against Confort was inevitable. I and my people were in unprecedented danger. This fear had been haunting her, causing sleepless nights and nightmares. Charlotte sighed, gazing toward the north. Aunt Martha entered with a tray of dinner. My lady, dinner is served. Lamb chops, mushroom soup, and fresh bread, Martha said kindly. The meal looked delicious. Usually, Charlotte would be pleased. Today, the sight of the greasy lamb made her stomach churn with nausea. She covered her mouth, turning pale. My lady, are you unwell? Martha asked, rushing over. Charlotte waved her off. I'm fine, Aunt Martha. It's just the stifling weather in the northern frontier. She tried to make an excuse, but she added, actually, I've had no appetite for days, especially for meat. Why is that? Martha's eyes flickered with realization. She remained calm. It's likely just the stress of the siege, my lady. You carry the safety of France City on your shoulders. It's natural to feel anxious. Charlotte frowned, still feeling uneasy. She bit her lip and whispered, also, my monthly cycle is 10 days late. Is that related? Martha's expression shifted. Her look was now one of knowing and cautious joy. She took Charlotte's cold hands and sat her down. Martha gazed at her gently. My child, tell me, is the nausea worse in the mornings? Charlotte nodded. Yes, it's worst when I wake up. Martha asked, do you feel fatigued and perhaps have some soreness in your chest? Charlotte blushed and nodded again. She hadn't realized these symptoms were connected. Martha smiled kindly and patted her hand. My dear Charlotte, based on my experience serving your mother and other noble women, you are not ill. She looked at Charlotte's abdomen. This is a blessing. A new life is growing within you. The Rochefort family may soon have a new member. Charlotte went blank, stunned by the confirmation. She touched her flat stomach with trembling hands. A child? Hers and mine. A wave of joy washed over her. It was the ultimate bond between us, momentarily eclipsing her fears. But then, the cold reality of our situation returned, swallowing her happiness. Charlotte, a noble lady, faced ruin due to an illicit pregnancy. I, her lover, was fighting in the dangerous northern territory, leaving her overwhelmed by fear and longing. She collapsed into Aunt Martha's arms, weeping uncontrollably. She sobbed like a helpless child, her shoulders trembling. Aunt Martha, she choked out. Please, don't tell anyone. Keep it a secret until he returns safely. Martha, having guessed my identity as the father, remained silent. She hugged Charlotte tightly, soothing her. Don't worry, child. I promise this secret stays between us. I will guard this secret with my life until he returns. Meanwhile, at old Osric Castle, Harold faced unexpected resistance. His main force was stalled by the castle's stubborn defense. Repeated assaults failed to shake the walls. A mysterious Plantagenet knight had taken command, displaying incredible martial prowess. He appeared wherever the fighting was fiercest. His battle-chi-infused sword cut through Solonians like a scythe. Any Solon foothold on the walls was quickly repelled by the knight's counterattacks. After days of fighting, Solonians had lost over 1,000 men without capturing a single section of the wall. Though mostly slaves died, Harold was frustrated. The castle's defense and the knight's skill exceeded his expectations. The knight was a formidable opponent. Asgier, commander of the Tiger Legion, suggested bypassing the castle. We usually raid the capital directly. Why waste strength here? Harold remained focused on the castle, unmoved. You lack vision, Asgier. My goal isn't just this fort. He revealed his true intent, to lure and destroy the approaching Plantagenet loyalist army. Asgier looked confused. Harold explained that scattering their forces would allow the Plantagenets to pick them off. They would concentrate their strength to crush our divided units. He pointed to the fields behind the castle. This fort is the bait. The king will be forced to send his main force to save it. I want them to come to us. Harold's eyes sharpened. We will fight a decisive battle on our terms. Crushing their main force will leave the north defenseless. Then the castle and the capital will be ours for the taking. Asgier realized. Besiege a point to strike reinforcements? Exactly, Harold nodded. True victory is decided before the battle begins. Learn, brother, war is won with the mind. By late September, the siege had lasted a month. The royal capital was in a state of panic and blame. Scribes and officials flooded the court with demands for action against the hesitant lords. Under the king's pressure, nobles finally began mobilizing. Armies from Saxony, Nuremberg, Rothenburg, and other territories marched toward the capital. Their varied equipment and slow coordination exposed the kingdom's systemic weaknesses. By mid-October, the coalition finally assembled near the capital. The force totaled nearly 50,000 men. Duke of Austin, an experienced veteran, was chosen as commander. Despite the facade of unity, the nobles were primarily focused on self-preservation. The army finally began its slow march toward Old Osric Castle. 10 days later, they crossed the Elbe River, 20 kilometers from the siege. Solon scouts watched their every move. Harold ordered his troops to hold back, luring the coalition into his trap. The Duke insisted on a 2-day rest after crossing the river. This allowed the troops to recover and scout the enemy. The Solon camp remained eerily quiet. This silence only fueled the nobles' anxiety. Pressed by the king, the Duke ordered the march to resume. The 50,000-strong force moved cautiously toward their uncertain fate. They were walking straight into Harold's trap. The Duke, experienced in fighting Solonians, ordered the use of wagon fort tactics. The army halted and began organizing their supply wagons. Soldiers chained the wagons together, forming a defensive ring against cavalry charges. I positioned cannons of various sizes and musketeers armed with matchlock muskets within the gaps of the wagon fort. I watched as spearmen and swordsmen formed dense phalanxes behind the wagons, ready to repel any enemy breach. Initially, I saw the sight of the Solon cavalry surging like a tidal wave across the horizon, which filled the inland loyalist army soldiers with terror. However, as I watched the sturdy wagon fort take shape, the sight of the towering wagons and bristling weaponry provided a sense of security that stabilized my troops. I heard the shouts of officers and the rhythmic beating of war drums, which helped me quell the initial panic. A grim determination to fight to the death behind our fortifications took hold, and I felt the soldiers' morale begin to solidify. Through the gaps in the wagon fort, I could clearly see the towering, battered silhouette of old Osric Castle on the distant hill. The Plantagenet kingdom flag still flew over the castle, proving it was still holding out, a massive morale boost for my loyalist army. Meanwhile, I observed the full scale of the Solon army being revealed. I watched as Harold committed his elite forces, leaving only a small detachment to monitor the castle while deploying the bulk of his cavalry and infantry on the plains. I saw cavalry circling our flanks like vultures, while infantry phalanxes advanced menacingly in the center. The Solon troops, frustrated by a month of failed sieges at old Osric Castle, were eager for battle, like tigers released from a cage. I knew they preferred this open-field combat, which played to their strengths. I watched their pent-up rage transform into a murderous desire to wash away their previous shame with the blood of my Plantagenet army. 10 kilometers south of old Osric Castle, I watched as nearly 100,000 troops from both sides completed their final deployments. My Plantagenet loyalist army stood firm behind their wagon fort, facing the aggressive, swarming Solon elite. I felt that the battle was on the verge of erupting. The Solon forces were vast. I saw their vanguard consisted of endless rows of cavalry, restless as a wolf pack, clad in leather or chainmail and armed with composite bows and scimitars. Behind them, I saw the disciplined, rock-solid Solon infantry. I watched as Solon scouts initiated the battle, circling in small groups like hyenas, galloping from various directions. Their feints and maneuvers kicked up dust, exerting immense psychological pressure on my Plantagenet lines. I felt the tension within my ranks become as taut as a bowstring. A soldier, overwhelmed by nerves or a sudden movement, accidentally pulled his matchlock musket trigger. Bang! I heard the sudden shot act like a fuse. I watched panic spread instantly as nearby soldiers fired reflexively. Fire! Fire! I heard someone scream in the chaos. Without orders, I saw thousands of musketeers and artillerymen light their fuses. Boom! 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 Bang! 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 Deafening gunfire erupted, drowning out all other sounds on the battlefield. Thick white smoke billowed, obscuring my view in front of the Plantagenet lines. I noted that most of the iron and lead projectiles missed their mark or fell short. The Solon scouts, having completed their harassment, skillfully wheeled their horses away just before the volley. I watched them circle the smoke-filled formation, coldly observing the confusion. As the fire slackened and the smoke cleared slightly, I saw the Solon cavalry seize the moment. With sharp whistles, they spurred their horses and charged back toward my formation. At a distance of 40 to 50 paces, I saw them unleash a high-arcing volley of arrows. The arrows rained down over the wagon fort, striking my confused and smoke-blinded soldiers. I heard officers shouting for shields, but the sounds of arrows striking flesh and men screaming filled the air. However, I observed that the Plantagenet response exceeded Solon expectations. I watched experienced officers quickly stabilize the lines after the initial casualties. Despite the pressure, I ordered the musketeers to fire a second, albeit ragged, volley, bringing down several Solon scouts who had ventured too close. I realized both sides suffered casualties in this exchange. My dense formation suffered more from the arrow rain, staining the ground behind the wagons red. Yet, thanks to the sturdy wagon fort and disciplined ranks, I saw the main line hold. Having lost over 100 men, I watched the Solon cavalry retreat to regroup, unable to breach the firepower. While the front lines were a chaotic inferno, I noted that the Solon main camp remained eerily disciplined. I saw Harold sitting calmly in his command center, his elite infantry and cavalry standing like statues. They watched the battlefield through the dust raised by the cavalry. I realized the Plantagenet forces were proving tougher than expected, our wagon fort a significant obstacle. As the skirmish continued, I noticed the Plantagenet firepower began to wane, with slower loading times and weaker volleys. Constant harassment and archery increased my casualties, causing my lines to show signs of wavering. However, I saw that the Solon forces were also suffering. The wagon fort was like a hedgehog, and their cavalry was being bled dry. I felt the balance of the battle teetering in the bloody stalemate, awaiting a decisive shift. From the highest tower of old Osric Castle, I knew Friedrich and his battle-worn defenders were watching the carnage to the south. Through his telescope, I imagined Friedrich observing the wagon fort, the Solon cavalry's relentless harassment, and the flashes of gunfire that sent Solon riders tumbling. The loyalist army has come. The king has not abandoned us, I heard Friedrich whisper, having prepared for a final stand just days earlier. Seeing the kingdom's banners and the disciplined formation, I knew a wave of relief and excitement washed over him. I watched him observe every detail of the conflict. Seeing the wagon fort hold against the initial Solon assault, I imagined him clenching his fists and cheering for his comrades. Yes, keep the formation. They have fewer men and are losing precious cavalry. If we hold, their momentum will break, and victory will be ours. I knew his analysis reignited hope in the exhausted defenders. It seemed the month of suffering was finally nearing its end. As I watched Friedrich observe the southern front with hope, a sudden, biting north wind whipped his hair across his face. The wind was sharp and cold, distinct from the breeze blowing from the battlefield. A sinking feeling gripped Friedrich. I watched him lower his telescope and scan the northern horizon. The clear sky was now choked by ink-black clouds, which descended upon the castle and raced southward with icy gusts. No, Friedrich paled, crying out. It's going to rain, a heavy downpour brought by the north wind. I knew the consequences. The loyalist army relied entirely on muskets and cannons. Rain would dampen their powder, rendering their firearms useless. Without ranged support, their wagon forts and cold steel could never withstand the Solon cavalry's mobility and archery. The clouds swept over the battlefield with terrifying speed. Darkness fell, and the wind whipped up dust before a torrential downpour began. This storm was a death knell for the Duke of Austin's tactical system. His entire defense was built upon the superiority of his ranged firepower. Rain soaked the matchlocks, extinguishing the fuses and ruining the powder. The artillerymen were helpless. The heavy cannons were useless in the rain, their fuses impossible to light. It's raining. The firearms are useless. I heard panicked cries erupt through the Plantagenet ranks. The formation broke into chaos as I watched soldiers stare at their useless muskets in terror. In contrast, I watched Harold remain calm, a cold smirk playing on his lips. He didn't need astrology to win, but he welcomed the goddess's favor. He signaled the general assault. I watched Isgir lead the Solon cavalry forward, their horses' hooves thundering like war drums against the mud. The Duke of Austin, though panicked, forced himself to act. Discard the firearms. Form ranks. Spearmen to the front. Swordsmen prepare for melee, he roared. I watched the soldiers drop their muskets and draw swords, clashing with the incoming Solonians. Unexpectedly, I saw the Solon cavalry dismount to join their elite infantry, forming squads that charged the wagon forts directly. The battle turned into a brutal melee. The Plantagenet forces used the wagon forts to hold their ground, inflicting heavy casualties. Corpses piled up, and blood mixed with the rain to stain the earth. Seeing the Solonians committing to a frontal assault, The Duke felt a flicker of hope, deeming their tactics reckless. They are fools to charge the wagons. If we hold, we win. Suddenly, a roar like a tidal wave erupted from the right flank. The Duke's view was blocked by the wagons and the chaos of battle. The Solonians attacking his front grew even more ferocious. Simultaneously, I heard screams of pure terror rise from the right flank. The right flank has collapsed. The Solon cavalry is flanking us. We're surrounded. Run. The Duke realized too late. The frontal assault was a feint to pin his main force. Harold's true strike was his elite cavalry, which had used the rain to circle and crush the vulnerable right flank. The right flank, held by unreliable mercenary forces, was poorly defended. The Solon charge shattered them instantly, and panic spread like a plague. The tide turned instantly. The Plantagenet wagon forts were now surrounded. The Duke realized the battle was lost. An hour later, the battlefield fell into a suffocating silence. The Plantagenet defense had been completely dismantled. The army of 50,000 was destroyed. Only a few thousand escaped, while the rest were killed or captured. The Duke of Austin died in the chaos, and his officers were taken prisoner. The nightmare had returned to the north. Outside old Osric Castle, I watched 100 Solon scouts ride in triumph. They carried captured noble banners, now muddied and blood-stained, fluttering in the rain. Ragged, bound Plantagenet officers were paraded beneath the castle walls. They were forced to call out their names and titles to the defenders above. I watched Friedrich and his men in silent, crushing humiliation. The last hope of relief vanished with the calling of those names. Despair washed over the defenders. I heard Asgier praise his brother. Your tactics were divine. These Plantagenet savages are weak. Harold remained humble, noting, it was the rain that decided the outcome. He added, do not be arrogant. We must consolidate our gains. Asgier asked, shall we storm old Osric Castle? We have thousands of captives to use as human shields to fill the trenches. Harold shook his head. No. Our goal is achieved. They are isolated. A storm is too costly. Keep the captives as slaves. They are valuable. He issued his final order. Send a surrender ultimatum. Tell them resistance means death, but surrender ensures survival. If they refuse, we starve them out. The main force moves south to the interior. The ultimatum was fired into the castle via arrow. The Solon commanders expected an immediate surrender. Suddenly, I saw a sentry point at the battlements. Chief, look at the wall. Harold raised his telescope. Beside the Plantagenet flag, a spear had been hoisted, bearing a rotting, severed head. I watched as Harold and his men recognized it instantly. The head of the Solon knight, Stark, killed by Friedrich a month prior. A head was displayed prominently on the ramparts, its silence more impactful than any war drum. Below it hung a banner in Solon and Plantagenet, reading, resist to the end, and this shall be your fate. Defect and be spared. Those who turn will be forgiven, paid, and granted land. Friedrich von Schmidt. This provocation hit the Solon soldiers like a slap. Bastards. Damned Plantagenet mongrels. How dare they insult us? The Solon soldiers below roared in fury, their eyes bloodshot, desperate to raise the castle. Yet, seeing the prepared defenses and recalling their recent heavy losses, none dared charge. Asgier gritted his teeth. Brother, this is a trap. They're forcing our hand. If we bypass them, our men will think we're afraid to avenge our fallen. It will shatter morale. Harold lowered his binoculars, his calm expression replaced by a complex mix of gravity, anger, and a flicker of admiration. He knew Asgier was right. This was a vicious, precise move, a public humiliation of Stark and the entire Solon army. It acted like oil on a fire, turning the soldiers' victory-fueled zeal into a blinding, vengeful rage. Every Solon soldier now burned with the singular desire to tear down the walls and slaughter the defenders. If Harold chose to bypass the castle now, he would be signaling fear and an unwillingness to avenge his warriors. Such a move would deal a devastating blow to the army's cohesion and spirit. Once morale breaks, it is nearly impossible to restore. Harold also saw Friedrich's deeper intent, a scorched earth tactic that forced both the Solon army and the castle defenders into a corner. After the loyalist army's destruction, Panic and defeatism surely plagued the castle. But Friedrich had effectively extinguished any hope of surrender. He made it clear to his men that the enraged Selunians would accept no surrender. The day the walls fell would be a day of slaughter. With no other option, the defenders were forced to unite and fight with desperate, lethal intensity. This Friedrich, he is truly difficult, Harold muttered, his voice heavy. He's used one head to force us both onto the bloodiest path possible. As Harold pondered, a thin figure in a Solon officer's uniform, but with distinct Plantagenet features, approached. Great Chieftain, Legion Commander Isgir, the man bowed. Harold's expression softened. Leon, you're here. This was the former commander of Old Osric Castle. During Heinrich Schee's third year of raiding, Leon had been forced to surrender when his supplies ran out and no reinforcements arrived. Unlike other discarded captives, Harold had recognized Leon's talent and knowledge of Plantagenet defenses, granting him status and trust. This gratitude turned Leon into a loyal advisor who helped Harold orchestrate his southern invasions with ruthless efficiency. Leon, you've seen it. Harold gestured to the banner. Friedrich's move is troublesome. Leon looked up, his eyes flashing with a complex light that quickly hardened into coldness. Great Chieftain, this move exposes his weakness. He is desperate for reinforcements and stability. The defender's morale is not as solid as it seems. Harold and Isgir focused on him. What do you suggest? Isgir asked. Leon smirked. Tomorrow, we select hundreds of Plantagenet captives and dress them in their own uniforms. Then, we embed our elite death squads among these as slaves. At dawn, we drive these defectors toward the gates, crying for sanctuary and claiming they've risen up against Friedrich. Harold's eyes gleamed as he grasped the plan. Leon continued. Seeing their own countrymen defecting, they will likely open the gates to honor Friedrich's own propaganda. Once the gates open, our death squads will seize them and create chaos. We strike, and Old Osric Castle falls. Brilliant, Isgir cheered. But if they see through it and fire on them? Leon smiled sinisterly. Even better. If Friedrich kills his own people, his banner becomes a joke. His promises of mercy will be exposed as lies. It will demoralize his men and prove to our captives that he is a hypocrite. We win either way. Harold finally smiled. He patted Leon's shoulder. Excellent. A truly poisonous plan. Isgir, prepare this immediately. Handle the selection of slaves and death squads personally. Secrecy is paramount. Yes, brother. Isgir left, energized. Harold looked at Old Osric Castle with cold, predatory intent. Friedrich, let's see how you handle this. Inside the castle, the atmosphere was suffocating. Bloodied officers reported to Friedrich, their voices raspy. Sir, the eastern wall has fewer than 200 men left standing. Sir, the western arrow tower and defenses have lost half their men. We are out of arrows, rocks, and logs. Sir, the northern guard. Sir, the reserves have been committed to the walls. We have no one left. Friedrich frowned at the grim statistics. He knew the garrison was exhausted and near collapse. There were fewer than 1,000 combat-ready men left, while Harold's army remained vast. Manpower, Friedrich muttered, turning to his scribe. Conscript all able-bodied men in the city. Tell them the Selunians refuse to accept surrender. If the city falls, it will be a massacre. The order hung in the air like a heavy stone. The officers exchanged glances, paralyzed by exhaustion and fear. The image of the loyalist army being crushed in the fields was burned into their minds. That defeat had shattered their last shred of hope. They had endured hunger and wounds only because they believed the kingdom's banners would return and reinforcements would arrive. Now, that hope was dead. We were now an isolated force, cut off from the world, our fate seemingly sealed. Friedrich's act of hanging enemy heads to provoke Harold had severed our last, albeit humiliating, hope for survival. The Selonians would not accept surrender. I knew that once the castle fell, a massacre was inevitable. Friedrich had made this clear, and I and the other officers knew it well. A heavy, resigned silence filled the room, and I felt a deep, lingering resentment toward Friedrich's ruthlessness. With no escape, I saw the choice was simple: die fighting or be slaughtered after the fall. For us officers, still clinging to a shred of honor, The former seemed the more dignified and, "Yes, knight." An older officer finally broke the suffocating silence, and I nodded in grim agreement. He saluted stiffly, and I watched as the others followed, moving like puppets. No one argued. We accepted our fate and left the command post with heavy, desolate steps. Perhaps we no longer sought victory, but only a warrior's death to leave a tragic name in a history that might never be written. As the doors closed, I watched Friedrich sit alone at the long table, illuminated by flickering candlelight. His facade of resolve faded, revealing deep exhaustion. I watched him lean back against the cold stone chair, staring blankly at the familiar defense map. He knew he had led us all to a dead end, himself included, and I knew he expected no miracles. He only aimed to organize a final, effective resistance to ensure we took as many Solonians with us as possible. Outside, I heard the scribe's trembling voice announce the call to arms, followed by cries of fear. Friedrich closed his eyes, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the table. He waited for Harold's final assault, the inevitable opening of the gates of fate. The room was silent, save for his breathing and the crackle of candles. At dawn, the Solon camp's horns signaled a new day of siege. Yet, I and the other defenders of old Osric Castle saw something unexpected. Instead of arrows or ladders, a crowd of ragged, starving Plantagenet people rushed toward the walls. They wore tattered uniforms or civilian clothes, screaming, "Help! Brothers, open the gates. We surrender. We won't serve the Solon barbarians anymore. Lord Friedrich, save us." I watched as the cries of women and children created a chaotic, tragic scene, and I saw the defenders waver. I saw many lower their weapons, moved by the sight of their own kin. A young officer asked Friedrich, "My lord, should we open the gates? They are surrendering, as we promised." An experienced officer countered, "No, look at them. They move strangely. Solonians are mixed in to seize the gate." We all turned to Friedrich for the final decision. Friedrich's expression remained cold and piercing, devoid of sympathy or anger. He spoke calmly. "Do you hear what they are shouting?" The officers hesitated. They are surrendering." Friedrich shook his head. "No, they are decoys. Solonians are using our people's clothes and cries to trick us into opening the gate." He addressed the soldiers. "What should we do with traitors and spies who serve the barbarians to destroy our home?" The officers realized his intent and roared, "Kill them." They ordered the artillery and archers. "They are Solon dogs. Fire. Leave none alive." Despite their hesitation, the soldiers obeyed the command. Boom, boom. Cannons roared, tearing bloody paths through the dense crowd. A hail of arrows and musket fire followed, turning the scene into a slaughterhouse. The Plantagenet slaves were mowed down, and I saw the hidden Solon elite caught off guard and decimated. Screams filled the air as the ground became a killing field. From the high ground, I watched Harold observe the carnage with a dark expression. "Friedrich is truly ruthless," he sneered, ignoring the pleas of his own people. Leon laughed. "It is for the best. This slaughter shatters his image of benevolence and loyalty. No deserter will trust him now. It is a massive blow to their morale." Asgir asked, "Brother, shall we attack?" Harold's eyes glinted. "Attack. Use the remaining slaves and the captured Plantagenet soldiers as human shields to exhaust their ammunition." "Yes." Drums thundered as the Solonians drove the slaves and captured loyalist soldiers toward the castle in a desperate wave. I and the other defenders, seeing our own comrades forced to attack, fought with heavy hearts but iron resolve. For our fallen brothers. Hold the wall. Muskets fired and logs rained down, crushing the front ranks, but the Solonians forced more to climb over the piles of corpses. Ladders were raised and pushed back, the battle turning into a brutal, close-quarters struggle. I watched Friedrich move across the wall, his sword stabilizing every faltering section of the defense. Blood stained the walls, and corpses piled high. With Friedrich's leadership and renewed morale, we held our ground against the relentless assault. By afternoon, nearly 1,000 of the forced Plantagenet attackers lay dead, and the Solonians had failed to gain a foothold. Harold, seeing the castle's high morale, lost his patience. He knew further attacks would only waste lives. He waved his hand. "Retreat." The horns sounded, signaling the end of the assault. I watched as the slave army, having failed to breach the fortress, fled back to their camp in disarray. I observed Harold take a final, resolute look at the impregnable fortress, his eyes filled with lingering frustration but firm determination. I saw him order Asgir to surround Old Osric Castle with 3,000 elite cavalry, ensuring no one escaped, while the main force prepared to bypass the castle and strike directly at Place. Understood, great leader. I heard as the order was swiftly relayed. I noted that the Solon army raised no objections. Their primary goal was raiding the south, not vengeance. I watched the massive Solon force begin moving, bypassing Old Osric Castle to surge toward the Plantagenet Kingdom's heart, the city of Place. I saw that only 3,000 elite cavalry remained, haunting the castle's perimeter in a tight blockade. I watched from the walls alongside Friedrich and his exhausted defenders as the Solon main force marched south, kicking up clouds of dust that blotted out the sky. I knew we had held the castle, but the true disaster had just begun. The Solonians were now marching toward the undefended royal capital. Looking south, I saw Friedrich's blood-stained face reflect deep gravity and helplessness. I knew he had done all he could. "Good luck, Your Majesty," I heard him whisper bitterly. "We have done our best." A month later, I saw that Conford remained under a strange siege, for 1,000 soldiers had tightly encircled the fortress and its outer walls for over 20 days. I observed the camp, which was fortified with banners and constant patrols, cutting off all movement. Yet, I noted that inside the isolated Conford, there was no panic or despair. At the foot of the mountain, I saw the cavalry training ground filled with dust. Though the siege prevented scouting, I observed that Leon never relaxed his training regimen. I heard the sounds of combat drills echoing across the field. I watched Leon, in light armor, observe the drills while Thorstein assisted in command. I learned they had managed to select 20 promising recruits from the new volunteers. I noted that only 5 had prior riding experience. The others were novices. The remaining 15 were, in Leon's words, bolder than they were skilled, having only ridden donkeys or mules, but I saw they were eager to learn. Regardless, I knew their cavalry force had expanded to 130 men. Despite the exhaustion, I saw that no one slacked off. I watched Thorstein wipe sweat from his brow, noting that the training was far more systematic than anything he had experienced in the Solon tribes. I knew Harold had preferred raw, irregular combat experience over disciplined, high-intensity training. I realized this rigorous, daily routine was challenging for a barbarian accustomed to freedom. Seeing the soldiers' improved coordination, I watched Leon finally look satisfied. I heard him blow a copper whistle to signal the end of training. "Assemble. Form up." I watched the cavalrymen quickly rein in their horses and form ranks with disciplined precision. I heard Leon address them. "Training ends here. Squad leaders, ensure the horses are groomed and gear maintained. Horses are our brothers. Weapons are our lives." "Dismissed." "Yes, Commander." I heard the soldiers shout in unison. I watched the unit disperse in an orderly fashion. I saw Leon and Thorstein dismount and walk toward the camp. I sensed that their shared combat and training had begun to bridge the gap of their past hatred. I heard Leon say calmly, "Thorstein, good work today. We must conserve grain and horse stamina during the siege." I watched Thorstein nod, admitting he had never realized how refined cavalry tactics could be compared to the Solonians' reliance on brute force. I knew he had learned much from Leon's systematic Plantagenet tactics. I saw Leon nod slightly, though I knew he still harbored deep resentment. I remembered the Solon invasion had cost him his family's land and his father's life. Yet, I saw he had to admit that Thorstein was different. I observed that Thorstein was brave, loyal to Conford, and offered valuable tactical insights. I felt Leon's perspective was subtly shifting. As they reached a fork in the road, I watched Thorstein look at Leon's solitary figure. I knew Leon was talented, trusted, and popular, yet he remained isolated. I noticed he never socialized or sought female companionship. It was as if he had locked his emotions behind his armor. I felt this loneliness resonate with Thorstein. "Leon," I heard Thorstein call out. I watched Leon stop and turn. I heard Thorstein smile sincerely. Training ended early. Would you like to join me for a simple meal? My wife is cooking. I saw Leon hesitate, instinctively wanting to refuse. No, Sir. I heard Thorstein interrupt. It's just a home-cooked meal. We can discuss those tactical details we didn't have time for earlier. I saw the mention of tactics pique Leon's interest. Seeing Thorstein's earnest gaze, I watched him nod. Very well, I'll join you. I saw Thorstein beam. Excellent. Follow me. I knew Thorstein's home was a sturdy, clean stone cottage assigned by me. As a high-ranking defector, I ensured he was well provided for. I smelled the scent of food as they entered. I saw a young woman, Lise, turn from the stove with a gentle smile. It was Lise. I knew she had initially feared Thorstein would abandon her upon arriving at Conford, but he had not. After Thorstein was granted a military position, I assigned him the cottage. I recalled Thorstein had requested permission for Lise to live with him, which I granted. I sensed Lise felt immense gratitude and relief. I saw she managed the cottage with care, becoming deeply devoted to him. I noted Thorstein treated her well, even entrusting her with his military pay and rations, saying, "These chores are better handled by you." Holding the supplies that symbolized stability and trust, I saw Lise feel the true meaning of home for the first time. Initially, Conford's residents whispered insults, calling Lise a barbarian's woman with disdain. As Thorstein proved his worth as a skilled cavalry captain under my command, the gossip faded. Now, neighbors even greet her with polite nods. "You're back," Lise greeted Thorstein, brushing dust from his armor. "Tired? Hungry? Dinner, stew and fresh rye bread, is ready." Her domestic warmth made the desperate struggles of Exile Slope feel like a distant nightmare. The hearth fire, the bubbling stew, and the silent, steady man before her formed a happiness she once dared not dream of. Noticing Leon behind him, she bowed shyly. Thorstein introduced him. "Lise, this is my commander, Leon of the cavalry platoon." Lise bowed respectfully. "Lord Leon, I've heard so much about your bravery." Leon waved a hand, awkward but polite. "No need for formalities, just call me Leon. I'm just Thorstein's comrade." Thorstein invited Leon inside. The cabin was tidy, with a simple meal laid out. The table held hot meat and turnip stew, pickled meat, and soft, partially wheat-based bread. It was a feast for a besieged city. They sat together. Despite initial awkwardness, they began to eat. Thorstein steered the conversation toward training, flank protection, and the tactical differences between Solon and Plantagenet cavalry. Engaging in familiar military territory, Leon opened up, and the two debated specific tactics. Lise listened contentedly, refilling their bowls. She loved seeing Thorstein integrate so well, making him seem more like a true Plantagenet. As they talked, the atmosphere lightened, and Leon's guarded expression softened. He admitted Thorstein's insights on Solon tactics were genuinely enlightening. After the meal, the cabin remained warm with the scent of food. Lise cleared the table, the clinking of dishes providing a comforting rhythm. Leon stood, his tall frame looming under the low ceiling. He bowed to them, his voice losing its battlefield edge. "Thank you for the hospitality. The meal was excellent, Lady Lise." The title Lady made Lise blush, a warm glow spreading through her. She wiped her hands on her apron, curtsying shyly. "You are too kind, Lord Leon. Please, visit us again." Her genuine joy shone in her eyes. This simple recognition meant more to her than any reward. Thorstein patted Leon's arm at the door. "Don't be a stranger, Leon. You're always welcome." Leon nodded, his profile softening in the night air. "I will," he said, stepping into the cool Conford night. Thorstein watched Leon's retreating figure from the porch. Unlike his usual icy isolation, Leon's back seemed to carry a hint of human warmth tonight, the cracks in his armor finally showing. Thorstein smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief. He knew this simple, human connection had done more to bridge their divide than any formal gesture. The iceberg was melting. He returned inside and closed the door. November 10th, the 11th year of Heinrich XI, would be a day of infamy for the Plantagenet kingdom. The city of Play, the heart of the kingdom, faced its darkest hour as the Solon wolf banners appeared on the horizon. Harold's main force had arrived after 2 months of raiding. The Solonians made no attempt to hide their arrogance. They set up camp just miles from Play's walls, raising Harold's Black Wolf flag. They treated the capital as if it were a mere village to be trampled. Solon scouts prowled near the walls like hungry hyenas. Only Friedrich's desperate defense had kept them at bay until now. This delay had allowed the court to scramble and bring some supplies and citizens inside. Inside the royal palace, the council chamber was in chaos. A bloody, dust-covered scout was dragged in by guards. He gasped. The Solon barbarians, they're here. Countless. Their vanguard is at the north gate. He collapsed, unconscious. The chamber erupted in panic. Heinrich XI turned deathly pale. He clutched a report from old Osric Castle. He finally realized the 50,000-strong loyalist army had been annihilated 10 days ago. The report slipped from his trembling hands. It hit the marble floor with a sharp clatter. Panic exploded. The kingdom is doomed. How did Blackstone Pass fall? What uses blame now? They're at the gates. How can we defend this? A duke wept, pleading for surrender. Negotiate. Give them gold. Give them the northern frontier. Just save the capital. A general roared back. Negotiating with barbarians is suicide. We must fight to the death. With what army? The loyalist army is gone. It's Rochefort's incompetence. He let them march right in. And Eisenberg. He lost the pass. The ministers bickered, shifting blame in a pathetic display of disorder. Enough! Heinrich's roar silenced the room. He stood, trembling with rage and terror. With bloodshot eyes, he screamed, "Shut up! The enemy is at our gates, and you argue like cowards. Have you no shame?" The room fell deathly silent. Heinrich gasped for air, forcing down his panic. "Issue the decree. Hear my command. Order Duke Schmidt, Duke Eichberg, and all their vassal nobles to assemble their armies and march north immediately to break the Solonian siege of the capital." Heinrich XI hammered his finger against the throne's armrest with every name, as if carving them into the wood. And, he roared, his voice distorted by terror, "Summon Count Rochefort from France City. Bring the Northern Iron Cavalry. Tell him the capital needs him now. Summon Count Eisenberg from the Eagle's Nest Fortress. Tell him the kingdom is at its end. He can no longer hide to preserve his strength. And Reynard at old Osric Castle. Since the Solonians have lifted the siege, order him to attack their rear. With the capital's garrison, we shall crush them." Heinrich XI stood, swaying with agitation, and bellowed at his trembling officials. "Draft the decree. Use the fastest horses and most loyal men. This is the king's final command. Anyone who delays or defies me will have their entire clan executed. Go. If we are late, the Plantagenet line is finished." A calm minister stepped forward, voice bitter. "Your Majesty, calm yourself. The south is too far. Count Rochefort is locked in a stalemate with Ulf's Sparrow Legion. He cannot come. Count Eisenberg's Eagle's Nest is surrounded and cut off. As for old Osric Castle, rumors say General Reynard has already surrendered." Surrendered? Heinrich collapsed onto his throne, his face deathly pale. Silence filled the hall, the atmosphere heavy with despair. A young, low-ranking official stepped forward, bowing. "Your Majesty, I have a suggestion." Heinrich focused his dimming gaze on him. "Speak." "Your Majesty, the kingdom still has an army in the northern frontier." "Where? Whose army?" Heinrich's eyes flickered with hope. "Do you recall the victory at Conford 6 months ago? Lord Karl von Schmidt, the second son of the Schmidt family, defeated the Solonians and captured their commander, Ingvar. Karl von Schmidt. Heinrich remembered the report that had once brought him joy. "Yes. Send an order for Lord Karl to march south and reinforce the capital." The official hesitated. He is far in the north and cannot reach Plays directly. But he could attack the enemy's rear, pinning the Sparrow Legion against Count Rochefort's forces at France City. Once the Legion is destroyed, they can join forces and march south to save the capital. This was pure armchair strategy. It ignored that Conford was also under siege and that the Sparrow Legion was formidable. Yet, in their desperation, they clung to this straw. Heinrich clapped his hands. "Excellent. Draft the decree. Send it via 1,000-mile express. Order Karl von Schmidt to attack the Sparrow Legion and then march south. If he succeeds, I shall name him king of the northern frontier with a hereditary title. As you command." the official replied, though he felt uneasy about the feasibility of the plan. Messengers rode out from Plays, risking death by Solonian scouts to reach the north. Surprisingly, the Solonian cavalry let the messengers pass with only a few arrows. The gates of Plays groaned shut, bracing for the coming siege. The kingdom's fate now rested on a small, besieged fortress and a young lord. The royal messengers eventually reached France City. They had hoped to travel via the field territory and Winter's Port, but the sea was frozen. Fearing the ice or Solonian patrols, they traveled overland. They arrived at France City to inform the count. It was futile. The Sparrow Legion surrounded the city, and Conford was equally cut off. The atmosphere in the governor's mansion was heavy. Count Rochefort read the royal decree, his brow furrowing in disgust. The order to have me attack the Sparrow Legion and then march south was pure fantasy. The count placed the decree on the table, looking at the trembling messenger with weary sarcasm. "I have received the king's order." The messenger pleaded, "My lord, the king is desperate. Please, you must try to execute this, or the court will hold you accountable." The count sneered. He knew this was just the king's panic and the court's search for a scapegoat. Following this order would destroy the last remaining forces in the north. His predecessor, William, had been dismissed for failing to support Conford, even though doing so would have been suicide. He could not openly defy the king, but he needed a practical alternative. My resistance at Conford was already tying down Solonian forces. Ulf had been forced to divert troops to Conford, easing pressure on France City. A plan began to form in the count's mind. France City held 45,000 troops, including 20,000 cavalry and 5,000 elite Northern Iron Cavalry. Previously, he had feared splitting his forces, but now, the balance had shifted. He could take a calculated risk. The count looked at the messenger. "I share the king's concern for the capital. However, as you can see, Conford is isolated. Ordering them to attack would be a death sentence. It serves no purpose, but I understand the intent. I shall adopt a more practical strategy." Count Rochefort pointed to old Osric Castle on the map. "I am dispatching 3,000 elite cavalry under Sir Kalen from France City to reinforce the castle immediately. If the castle holds, they will break the siege. If Reynard has surrendered, Sir Kalen will bypass the Solonians and head straight to Plays to bolster the capital's defense." He told the envoy, "This is a fresh, reliable force. The maximum support France City can provide while maintaining its own security. What say you?" The envoy found this plan far more practical than the king's original order to pincer the Sparrow Legion. Seeing a tangible relief force, the envoy bowed. "The count is far-sighted. This is an excellent plan. I shall report your loyalty and the reality of the situation to His Majesty. He will surely understand." Count Rochefort ordered his adjutant, "Tell Sir Kalen to muster 3,000 cavalry from the 1st and 2nd battalions, carry 10 days' rations, and depart at once. Remind them, their mission is mobility and relief. Avoid entanglement with the enemy main force. Reach Osric Castle or Plays as fast as possible." "Understood, my lord." The adjutant left, and soon the horns of France City sounded. Under Sir Kalen's command, the elite cavalry slipped out through a hidden side gate. The envoy watched the dust trail, relieved, while Count Rochefort stood on the ramparts, his gaze heavy. He knew this mission was perilous, but it was the only choice that served the kingdom's interests. As for Conford and me, he sighed silently, hoping the young man who always created miracles could survive once more. 3 days later, Sir Kalen's 3,000 cavalry arrived at the woodlands surrounding old Osric Castle. Kalen reined in his horse and raised his telescope. Seeing the orderly Solon cavalry camps and the Plantagenet royal flag still flying atop the walls, he exhaled in relief. Osric Castle still stands. General Reynard hasn't surrendered. Kalen felt a surge of joy. The scene confirmed that Reynard had successfully held the fortress and pinned down a significant portion of the Solonians. However, he noted the Solonians were numerous, well-organized, and vigilant, clearly an experienced force. His own horses were exhausted from the forced march. A direct assault would be futile and likely result in a repulse. Order the troops to hide in the valley forest. Feed the horses, check the gear, and send scouts to observe the enemy's patterns, Kalen commanded. The troops vanished into the dense forest to rest and prepare. Kalen stood on a high ridge, his mind racing as he studied the situation. A direct assault was impossible. He needed to lure them out and force a decisive battle, ideally with the garrison's help. He decided on a risky feint. Kalen briefed his officers. I will lead 500 cavalry as bait to the open ground southeast of the castle to provoke the Selonians. You will remain hidden with the 2,500-strong main force. Do not attack without my signal. If the garrison sees us in sorties, we will pincer them. When you see my signal, charge from the flanks and rear to annihilate them. If the garrison doesn't react, I will lead the enemy into our ambush zone. Then, you strike hard and fast. Understood, sir. Kalen proceeded without hesitation. He led 500 brave knights out of the forest, arraying them on a grassy slope a mile from the Solon camp, making a loud, defiant display. Atop old Osric Castle, Lord Friedrich, look, to the southeast, a sentry shouted. Friedrich rushed to the battlements and raised his telescope. On the horizon, a small but well-equipped force of Plantagenet cavalry was arrayed, flying the banners of France City. Reinforcements from France City. The soldiers cheered, their spirits soaring. Friedrich, however, frowned. There were only hundreds of them against at least 3,000 Selonians. Was this a suicide mission? No, Friedrich realized. Count Rochefort wouldn't send so few, nor would his commander be this reckless. He scanned the silent forest nearby. They are baiting the Selonians. Their main force must be in the woods, waiting for us to strike or for the enemy to enter their trap. My lord, should we sortie? An officer asked. Opening the gates was risky. If the Selonians rushed the breach, the castle would fall. Was this a Selonian trick to lure them out? Friedrich faced an agonizing choice. He watched the small force and the Selonians beginning to mount up. These 500 men were risking everything for them. He could not stand idly by. Friedrich turned, his voice firm. Order the cavalry and all able-bodied soldiers to assemble. Open the gates. We sortie to support our allies. My lord, that's too dangerous. Execute the order. We cannot let our comrades fight alone. This is our chance to crush the Selonians. The gates groaned open as the last 100 mounted defenders gathered. For the Plantagenet. Charge. Friedrich led the way, his men roaring as they surged out like a flood, slamming into the flank of the Selonians who were preparing to engage Kalen. Kill. The Selonians were thrown into chaos by the unexpected rear assault. Seeing the garrison charge, Sir Kalen smiled. He blew his horn, signaling the full assault. Thunderous hoofbeats erupted from the forest as 2,500 fresh France City cavalry charged like an iron tide into the disorganized Selonian ranks. It's a trap. The Selonian commander paled as he realized they were caught in a pincer. Despite the ambush, the Solon cavalry remained disciplined. Their commander roared, "Hold formation, fall back and provide cover. Move." The Selonians quickly tightened their ranks, resisting fiercely while retreating toward the open ground behind their camp. They used expert horse archery to harass their pursuers and create distance. Friedrich and Kalen's cavalry charged hard, but the Selonians' disciplined retreat prevented a total encirclement. After 30 minutes, the Selonians escaped toward their main southern force, leaving behind a ruined camp and hundreds of corpses. With the Plantagenet banners flying, I watched as Friedrich and Kalen's forces finally united at Osric Castle. Soldiers cheered the relief. I watched Sir Kalen approach Friedrich, and both exchanged formal knightly salutes. Sir Kalen of Ross, sent by Count Rochefort, you and your men have performed a miracle holding Osric Castle, Kalen said with admiration. Friedrich bowed modestly. It is a knight's duty. We owe our gratitude to you and Count Rochefort for your perilous journey to save us. Impressed by the young knight's powerful battle chi, Kalen asked, Forgive my ignorance, but may I ask your name? I am Friedrich von Schmidt, a Tier 4 knight, and heir to the Schmidt family. Kalen nodded, then asked, And General Reynard? Friedrich replied calmly. Count Reynard is elderly and unwell. The stress of the war has exhausted him. I returned from the Blackstone Pass front and, seeing the crisis, took command of the defense at his request. I knew this explanation shielded Reynard from the shame of his near surrender while justifying Friedrich's authority. Kalen nodded, satisfied. It is a blessing for the kingdom that you were here to lead, Sir Friedrich. He accepted the explanation, finding it logical for a Tier 4 knight to take charge during a crisis. Kalen requested, "My men are exhausted from the forced march. May we rest in the castle?" "Of course. You are our saviors," Friedrich agreed, ordering the gates opened. Despite the siege-induced shortages, I saw the garrison and citizens share their remaining rations to honor the reinforcements from France City. Soldiers gathered around campfires, sharing food and stories, the joy of survival briefly masking the war's gloom. In the command room, I listened as Friedrich and Kalen discussed the next move. Kalen spoke gravely. "We cannot stay long. Count Rochefort ordered me to march south to the royal capital of Play immediately after relieving you. The Solon main force is at the gates. The king is in grave danger." Friedrich analyzed the situation. "I understand, but be cautious. Harold's main army vastly outnumbers us. Your 3,000 men are elite, but a direct assault is suicide and may lead to your total destruction." Kalen sighed. "I know the risks, but the king must be saved. Even if we only distract them, it is our duty." Seeing Kalen's resolve, Friedrich nodded. "Your loyalty is admirable." Friedrich stood up, eyes sharp. "In that case, I will join you." Kalen protested. "You cannot. Osric Castle is vulnerable and needs your leadership to rebuild." Friedrich shook his head. "Defending the king is the duty of every Plantagenet knight. I have already arranged for the castle's defense. My Tier 4 combat power will be vital on the road to the capital. My presence may be the difference between life and death for the king." Touched by his resolve, Kalen clapped his shoulder. "Very well. It is an honor to fight alongside you." "The honor is mine, Sir Kalen," Friedrich replied. The next morning, I joined Friedrich and 10 of his bravest knights as we accompanied Kalen's force. The combined cavalry quietly departed Osric Castle, racing toward Play. 2 days later, we reached the outskirts of Play, finding the city surrounded by Solon camps. However, the force was smaller than expected, only about 10,000, mostly cavalry, lacking heavy siege equipment. "It seems Harold's main force has bypassed Play to raid the wealthy south," Friedrich observed. "This force is merely here to contain the capital." Kalen gritted his teeth. "Damn them. Regardless, we must break the siege." The army hid in nearby hills to rest our horses and prepare our gear. By late afternoon, Kalen and Friedrich decided the time was right. "Soldiers," Kalen shouted, "the king awaits. Let us crush these barbarians and open the gates." "For the king. For Plantagenet. Charge," Friedrich roared, raising his sword. 3,000 cavalry surged from the hills like a flood, slamming into the Solon camp at the south gate. The thunder of hooves shook the earth, throwing the unsuspecting Solonians into chaos. The Solonians, veterans of many battles, quickly mounted up and launched a fierce countercharge. The two forces collided in a brutal melee of steel, screams, and dying horses. The Plantagenet cavalry's momentum initially shattered the Solon lines. However, the Solonians' superior numbers and individual skill soon stabilized the front, turning the battle into a bloody stalemate. I watched as Friedrich and Kalen fought at the vanguard, cutting down enemies, but the Solonians fought desperately to keep them from reaching the city gates. The battle was brutal, with every step bought in blood. I watched as King Heinrich XI, alerted by the din of combat, ascended the south gate tower of Play City. Seeing the Plantagenet reinforcements clashing with the vastly superior Solon cavalry, I observed the king trembling with sudden, overwhelming hope. "Reinforcements? They've actually come," Heinrich stammered, nearly incoherent, as I stood nearby. Desperate, he seized this glimmer of hope. "Archers and musketeers, fire! Support our cavalry," he commanded hoarsely. "By the king's order. Fire!" I shouted along with the others. Volleys of arrows and musket fire rained down. While accuracy was limited by the chaotic melee, I saw the barrage provide crucial psychological pressure and support for Kalen and Friedrich's forces. However, I noted that the Solon rearguard proved unexpectedly formidable. Despite their fierce charge, I watched as Kalen and Friedrich's forces suffered mounting casualties under the pincer attack. Within 30 minutes, I saw hundreds of cavalrymen fall. "We can't keep this up," Kalen shouted to Friedrich after felling a Solon officer. "Too many enemies. We must enter the city." Friedrich agreed, deflecting an arrow. "Push for the gate." Seeing their plight, I watched Heinrich ignore his minister's protests. "Open the gate. Let our warriors in." "Your Majesty, it's dangerous," the guard captain warned. "Open it," Heinrich roared. As the heavy south gate creaked open, I watched Kalen and Friedrich lead their remaining men in a desperate final charge. The Solons swarmed the gate, sparking a desperate, bloody struggle for control that I witnessed from the ramparts.